The auctioneer grabbed Elsie by the wrist. Not Clara's wrist, the child's, the 2-year-old's. He yanked the little girl sideways like she was a sack of grain he was trying to shake loose from her mother's arms, and when Clara screamed and pulled back, he laughed. Right into her face, tobacco-stained teeth and breath that smelled like something rotting, and he laughed and said to the crowd gathered in the dirt, "See how she fights for it? Must be worth something after all." The crowd thought that was funny. Clara did not let go. If you've ever stood in a place where no one was coming to help you, where the people watching could help but chose not to, then you already know what that moment felt like. If you haven't, then count yourself lucky. And stay with this story, because what happens next is the kind of thing that changes how you understand people. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1876, and a woman who refused to let go. The winter of 1875 had killed things that were supposed to survive. It killed the Whitmore cattle first, one by one through November, their bodies stiffening in the fields before Clara and her husband Thomas could drag them under shelter. Then it killed Thomas's spirit, though he wouldn't admit it. She could see it happening, the way a man stops making plans and starts just enduring. By January, it killed the wheat they'd banked in the cellar, the rot moving through the burlap sacks so quietly that Clara didn't find it until she reached in for a handful and came out with black mush. And then, in the first week of February, in a way she still couldn't let herself think about directly even now, the winter finished what it started. Thomas had gone out in a storm to check on the 2 horses they had left. He didn't come back. She found him at dawn when the wind dropped, face down in the snow 40 yards from the barn. The horses were fine. That detail had stuck in Clara's mind like a splinter she couldn't reach. The horses were fine, standing warm in their stall, and Thomas was dead in the snow between here and there. Elsie had been 14 months old. Clara had kept them alive through February and March, on the last of their canned goods, and sheer refusal to stop. She told herself there were people who came back from worse. She told herself that when the ground thawed, she could plant, could build, could find some way forward. She was 24 years old and had walked 2,000 miles from Ohio with a man she loved to make something real in Wyoming, and she was not going to lie down in the snow beside him. But she hadn't known about the men. She hadn't known that the land beneath the Whitmore claim, 160 acres that she and Thomas had filed legal papers on, papers she kept in a tin box under the floorboard, sat directly in the path of something much larger and much colder than the winter that had already tried to kill her. She hadn't known that a group of men operating out of Casper were quietly pushing settlers off a stretch of valley land that the railroad had already agreed to buy for 3 times its surface value. She hadn't known that those men had a method, and that the method was simple. Wait for families to get desperate enough, then give them a push. The push came on a Tuesday in late March. 4 riders arrived at the Whitmore claim at mid-morning, and the one who did the talking was named Harlan Goss. He was not what Clara expected. He wasn't loud or violent. He was polite. He had a clean coat and a watch chain, and he spoke to her from the saddle with the measured patience of a man who had done this many times before and found that patience worked just as well as threats and cost less energy. He told her the claim had irregularities in the filing. He told her that a legal review had determined the original paperwork was insufficient. He told her she had until Friday to vacate the property. Clara said, "My husband filed that claim legally. I have the documents." Harlan Goss looked at her the way a man looks at a child who has said something they believe but that he knows to be irrelevant. "Ma'am," he said, "documents don't mean much if the filing office doesn't have record of them." "Then I'll go to the filing office." "That's a long ride for a woman alone with a young child." "I'll manage." He nodded slowly, like he appreciated her spirit in the abstract. Then he said, "Friday, Mrs. Whitmore," and rode away with his 3 men without another word. Clara stood in the doorway holding Elsie against her hip and watched them go. She felt the cold of the ground coming up through the soles of her boots. She understood, somewhere below the level of words, that the conversation had not been what it appeared to be. He hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to inform her. The difference between those 2 things was everything. She left for Casper the next morning with Elsie wrapped against her chest and the tin box of documents tucked inside her coat. She never made it. 2 of Goss's men intercepted her on the road. Not violently, not at first. They were very sorry, they said. She seemed confused, they said. They would help her get somewhere safe. They took the tin box from her before she understood what was happening, because she'd been focused on holding on to Elsie and had not expected their hands to move that quickly. By the time she understood and fought back, one of them had pried Elsie loose from her grip, and the other had her arms pinned behind her, and she heard herself making a sound she'd never made before in her life, a raw animal sound that didn't feel like it came from her throat. "Stop fighting," the man holding her said. Not mean, just tired. "You're going to hurt yourself." She didn't stop fighting. She fought until she couldn't, and then she was sitting in the dirt on the side of the road with nothing. No tin box. No horse. No documents. Just Elsie on her lap, crying because Clara was crying, and the sound of hoofbeats fading west. What happened over the next 2 weeks, Clara would later describe only in fragments, because that was how she experienced it. A series of fragments without the connective tissue of logic or agency. A family who took them in for 3 nights, and then asked them to leave because they couldn't afford another mouth. A town where she tried to report to the sheriff and was told the matter was a civil dispute and outside his jurisdiction. A phrase she came to understand meant he knew who Harlan Goss was and had made his decision accordingly. A night in a barn that didn't belong to anyone she knew. 2 days when she fed Elsie everything they had and ate nothing herself and told herself it was fine. She'd been hungry before. She hadn't been this hungry before. And then she arrived in Millhaven, a settlement that was barely a town yet, just a main road with ambitions, and heard from a woman at the well that there was a man there who could help, who bought people's problems and gave them a fresh start, who had an arrangement with certain settlers who'd lost their way. The woman at the well said it with the particular kindness of someone who doesn't want to tell you the truth, but doesn't want to lie to you either. Clara, who had not slept properly in 12 days, and whose daughter was beginning to develop the glassy look of real hunger, said, "Where do I find him?" The arrangement turned out to be an auction, not horses, not land, people. She understood this slowly, standing in the crowd on the main road in Millhaven, watching 2 men ahead of her go up on a rough wooden platform and be sold, one to a mining outfit that needed labor, one to a farming family that needed hands. She understood that she had arrived at a place where certain kinds of desperation were treated as a marketplace, and that the man who ran it, a heavy-set figure in a stained vest named Roy Pickett, had built a tidy little business on the gap between what desperate people needed and what other people were willing to pay for them. She nearly walked away. She stood at the edge of the crowd with Elsie on her hip and thought about walking away. Elsie's cheek was too warm against hers. The girl hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Clara's arms were shaking, not from fear, from the sustained physical effort of carrying a child for 2 weeks without enough food to fuel the carrying. She didn't walk away. When Pickett called for the next offering and one of his men gestured her toward the platform, she went. She told herself she was doing it because Elsie needed to eat. She told herself that whatever happened next, she could survive it, and survival was the only thing that mattered right now. She did not let herself think about what people were willing to pay for a woman alone. The platform was 2 wooden pallets nailed together. It shifted under her weight. The crowd that looked up at her was mostly men, dusty and weather-beaten and varying in their expressions from indifferent to openly speculative, and she looked back at them without blinking because she had learned in the past 2 weeks that the moment you looked down, something changed in how people treated you. Pickett stood to her right, working through his introduction with the bored fluency of a man who'd given the same speech 100 times. "Widowed," he said. Claim jumped. "Strong enough to work, healthy enough to travel. The child was 2, trainable, would be useful in a few years." Clara heard herself described in the third person, like a property assessment, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very hard. Then Pickett did something she didn't expect. He reached over and took Elsie's wrist. Not her wrist, the child's. He grabbed it and pulled, testing the grip, the way you'd pull on a joint you were checking for weakness. And Elsie let out a sharp cry of surprise and pain, and Clara felt her whole body move before she'd decided to move. She yanked Elsie back, hard, one arm pulling the child against her chest, and the other hand shoving Pickett's arm away with a force that surprised them both. The crowd went quiet for a second. Then Pickett laughed. He turned to the crowd and laughed and gestured at Clara like she was the punchline of the joke he'd been building toward. And the crowd laughed with him, the relieved laughter of people who'd been tense and needed somewhere to put it. And Pickett said, "See how she fights for it? Must be worth something after all." Clara stood on the shifting pallets and held her daughter and did not look down. Pickett turned back to her, still smiling, and lowered his voice just enough that it felt private, though nothing about where they were standing was private. Don't make this harder than it has to be, he said. You fight me on this platform and I'll take the girl separate. You understand me? I'll sell her separate. Clara understood him. She understood that he'd done this before. She understood that the threat was real. She understood that the ground she was standing on had no stable point, that every direction she could move in had been anticipated and blocked by a man who did this for a living and had learned exactly where the pressure points were. She stopped fighting. She held Elsie against her chest, and she stood still, and she looked out over the crowd with her chin up, and she said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. She had tried documents, and she had tried reporting it, and she had tried walking away, and she had tried fighting back, and she had tried survival on her own terms. And all of those things had led her here, to 2 wooden pallets in the dirt in Millhaven, Wyoming, being sold to whoever wanted her. Pickett worked the crowd. He called for bids. There were a few, low, half-hearted, the bids of men who weren't sure they wanted what they were bidding on but thought they might as well. Clara listened to the numbers, and each one landed somewhere inside her that she didn't have a name for. Not shame, exactly. Not exactly grief. Something more specific than either one, a feeling that she would have to figure out how to carry for the rest of her life or learn to put down entirely, and she didn't know yet which one she was going to choose. The bidding slowed. The numbers were low. Pickett pushed for more and got silence, and he made a show of his exasperation, and he said something about what a waste it was. What a shame. Starting price was 1 coin if no one else was going to step up, and someone in the back of the crowd made a comment that drew a few more laughs. And then, from somewhere at the edge of everything, there was the sound of hoofbeats. Not the sound of someone arriving. The sound of someone arriving with intention. The rhythm of it was different. Not a horse walking in casually, but a horse brought to a deliberate halt, weight shifting, someone pulling up. The crowd heard it and turned, the way crowds always turn toward something new, and the laughing stopped, and even Pickett paused with his mouth open and looked toward the road. Clara looked too. She did not know the man. She had never seen him before. He was covered in trail dust from his hat brim to his boot heels, and he sat his horse with the stillness of someone who was used to being looked at, and had long ago decided it wasn't worth having feelings about. His eyes moved across the crowd without hurry, and then they moved to the platform, and they found Clara and Elsie, and they stayed there. He didn't say anything yet. He just looked. And something in Clara, something she would not be able to explain later, something she'd have called instinct if she believed in instinct and stubbornness if she didn't, went very still. Pickett recovered first. "Help you with something?" he called. The man on the horse reached into his coat. He pulled out money. Not a coin. Bills. He held them up without looking at Pickett, still looking at the platform, and he said, in a voice that was quiet enough that the crowd went still to hear it, "What's the price?" Pickett blinked. He'd been doing this long enough to recognize when something had shifted, even when he didn't understand why. He named a number. A real number, not the charity floor he'd been about to settle for. The man on the horse didn't negotiate. He rode forward, slow, through the crowd that parted for him without quite knowing why they were doing it, and he counted out what was asked and held it toward Pickett, and when Pickett took it, the man finally looked at him directly. "They're done here," he said. It was not a question. Pickett looked at the money in his hand. He looked at the man. He looked at the crowd, which had nothing to offer him. He folded the bills and put them in his vest pocket. "They're done here," he agreed. The man dismounted. He was tall, not remarkable, the kind of tall that comes from years of hard physical work rather than natural gift. He walked to the platform and held out his hand to help Clara down, and she looked at it for a moment. His hand, rough-palmed, a scar across 2 knuckles. And then she looked at his face. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he said. "You don't." "Why are you doing this?" He thought about it. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it, actually taking a moment before he answered. "Because some things are worth more than gold," he said finally, which was not the answer she expected, and which did not explain anything, and which she would spend a long time turning over afterward. She took his hand and stepped down from the platform. Elsie twisted in her arms to look at him, the frank and total attention of a 2-year-old, and the man met her gaze with the same steadiness he'd turned on everything else, and then looked back at Clara. "My name is Ethan Callahan," he said. "I have a ranch 2 days' ride from here. You can come or you don't have to come. That's your choice." Clara looked at him. She was 24 years old and she had been on her feet for 2 weeks, and her daughter was too warm against her neck and she had nothing left. No documents, no home, no plan, no reserve. She had run out of options in the exact sequence she'd tried to use them. She said, "Why would you offer that to a stranger?" Ethan Callahan looked at her with something in his face that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite recognition, something between the two. "Because you carried her this far alone," he said. "You don't have to carry the weight anymore. Your burden is mine now." Clara didn't believe him. She had stopped believing things that sounded too good on first hearing, had learned that lesson the hard way, and planned to keep it. But Elsie needed food and warmth, and Clara needed both of those things too, and the man's eyes were steady, and the crowd around them had already started losing interest and drifting, and there was no other offer coming. She shifted Elsie on her hip and lifted her chin and said, 2 days' ride. 2 days, he confirmed, and I make my own choices. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, more the suggestion of one, the kind a face makes when it respects something it just heard. "Wouldn't have it any other way," he said. She followed him to his horse. She didn't trust him. She made that clear to herself even as she walked. Whatever came next, she would keep her eyes open and her thinking straight. She had made the mistake of trusting the ground under her feet, and the ground had gone, and she wasn't going to make the same mistake twice just because someone had ridden in at the right moment with money and a quiet voice and something that looked like steadiness. She wasn't going to mistake rescue for safety, but she was going to get her daughter somewhere warm. That was enough for now. That had to be enough. The dust of Mill Haven settled behind them as they rode west into the afternoon, and Clara held Elsie close and kept her face forward and did not look back at the auction platform, and did not look back at Roy Pickett counting money by the road, and did not look back at any of the faces that had watched her stand there and done nothing. There was nothing behind her worth looking at. There never had been. They rode for the first hour without speaking. Clara had expected questions. She'd braced for them. The kind men asked when they thought they'd earned the right to know things, the kind that started with "so" and ended with her having to explain herself to someone who hadn't been there. But Ethan Callahan rode beside her in silence that didn't feel like waiting. It felt like the kind of silence a person earns after years of being alone in open country, where talking takes something out of you that the land doesn't give back. Elsie fell asleep against Clara's chest before they cleared the edge of Mill Haven. The child's weight settled and her breathing slowed, and Clara felt the trembling in her own arms that she'd been holding back for 2 weeks. The sustained physical cost of carrying a child mile after mile on not enough food and not enough sleep, and she breathed through it quietly and didn't let it show. She was watching him. Not obviously. She'd learned something about watching people without appearing to, had learned it in the weeks since Thomas died, since men's faces had become the primary text she had to read to know what was coming. Ethan rode with his back straight but not rigid, the easy posture of someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than out of one. His hands on the reins were light. His eyes moved across the terrain ahead in a pattern that wasn't casual. There was method to it, a slow sweep left to middle to right and then back. The way someone reads ground rather than just looks at it. She'd met soldiers who looked at landscape like that. She'd met Thomas's older brother, who'd come back from the war looking at everything like it might need to be crossed or defended. Ethan had that same quality but quieter, less haunted. More like the habit had simply become part of how he existed, rather than something the war had carved into him against his will. "Where did you serve?" she asked. He glanced at her. "What makes you think I served?" "The way you look at ground." He was quiet for a moment. "Cavalry," he said. 10 years. Scout, mostly, by the end. "Where?" "Montana first, then down through Dakota Territory. Sometime in Kansas." He paused. "I didn't like Kansas." "Nobody likes Kansas," Clara said, and was surprised to hear how flat her own voice sounded, how empty of anything. She'd meant it as something, a small joke, a point of contact, but it came out of her like a stone dropping into water. Ethan didn't seem to notice, or didn't mind. "You're from Ohio," he said. Not a question. "How do you know that?" "The way you said nobody. There's something Ohio in it. My mother was from Cincinnati." Clara looked at him. "Your mother?" "She's gone. Has been for a while." She didn't push it. She'd learned that particular kind of gone had its own geography, and she'd learned not to walk into it uninvited. "I'm from Dayton," she said instead. He nodded like that settled something. They rode on. The land around them was opening up the way Wyoming land does in late afternoon, the light going sideways and gold, and making everything longer than it really was. Clara had loved this light when she and Thomas first came west. had stood outside their half-built cabin in the evenings and felt something expand in her chest at the sheer scale of the sky. Now she watched it and felt nothing except a mild calculation about how much warmth it had left before dark. "Your daughter," Ethan said. "She eat today?" "No." He reached into one of his saddlebags without looking, which meant he knew exactly what was in it and where, and pulled out a piece of dried meat wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her. "For when she wakes up." Clara looked at it. "I'm not going to ask you to be grateful," he said. "It's just food." She took it. They stopped at dusk at a creek she didn't know the name of, and Ethan built a fire with an efficiency that came from having done it thousands of times and finding nothing remarkable about it. Clara sat on a rock with Elsie in her lap and woke her daughter gently, and the girl ate the dried meat in small pieces with the serious concentration of a child who understood on some animal level that food mattered right now, and Clara fed her and tried to remember the last time she'd watched her daughter eat without counting the pieces. Ethan cooked something from his pack over the fire. It wasn't good, salt pork and cornmeal, roughly done, but he handed her a portion without ceremony, and Clara ate it without ceremony, and that was the whole transaction. "Goss sent those men after you," Ethan said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the fire. Clara went still. "You know Harlan Goss. I know what he does. I know the land he's been clearing and who he's clearing it for." He picked up a stick and pushed at the fire's edge. "I know about the railroad." "Then you know more than I do," she said, and heard the edge in her own voice, the frustration of someone who'd been operating blind and only understood it afterward. "I had documents, a proper filing. He told me there were irregularities." "There weren't," Ethan said. "The irregularities are something he creates after the fact. He has someone inside the county filing office. Once he decides he wants a piece of land, the paperwork develops problems." Clara stared at him. The fire snapped between them. "How do you know this?" "Because he tried it with me." The silence after that was different from the earlier silence. It had weight. "He tried it with me 3 years ago," Ethan said. "I had my paperwork in order. I also had a lawyer in Cheyenne, which most settlers don't. The lawyer found the filing office record before it disappeared." He looked up from the fire. "Goss backed off. But he doesn't forget. Is that why you were in Millhaven?" He looked at her steadily. "I was passing through." Clara held his gaze. "Were you?" He didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. "I'd heard Goss had pushed another family off their claim," he said finally. "I went to see what I could find out. What I found was—" He stopped, looked back at the fire. "What I found was a woman on a platform with a child and a crowd that thought it was entertainment." Clara looked down at Elsie, who had fallen asleep again in her lap, a piece of dried meat still in her small fist. Something moved through Clara's chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. It was something slower and more permanent, the feeling of understanding something about the world that you can't un-understand. "I didn't need saving," she said. "I need my documents back." "I know," Ethan said. "I need those men held accountable." "I know. I need—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. There was a list, a long one, and the top of it was immediate and practical, and the rest of it stretched so far into the future she couldn't see the end of it, and right now she was sitting at a fire in the dark in the middle of Wyoming with a sleeping child and a man she'd known for 6 hours, and she had run out of whatever was fueling the list. "Get some sleep," Ethan said. Not unkind, just direct, the way someone speaks when they've decided what the next necessary thing is. "Tomorrow's a full day's ride. Night after that, we'll reach my place." "I don't sleep well," Clara said. "I know," he said, for the third time, and something about that, the plain acknowledgement of it, not the offer to fix it, made something in her chest settle by a fraction of an inch. She slept. She was surprised in the morning to discover she had. The second day was harder. Elsie, rested and fed, was no longer the quiet, exhausted weight of the day before, but a 2-year-old with opinions, who wanted to be put down and walk and couldn't, who wanted things Clara didn't have and said so in the particular way toddlers communicate, with their whole body and no internal filter. Clara managed her with a patience she had to consciously manufacture, digging for it somewhere underneath the tiredness, and Ethan rode beside them without comment, except once, when Elsie had been crying for 20 minutes, and he reached into his saddlebag again and produced a small, hard biscuit, slightly stale, which he offered to the child directly. Elsie stopped crying and examined him with total suspicion and then took the biscuit. You have children? Clara asked. No. You know how to handle them. He thought about it. I know how to handle things that need something specific and can't say what it is, he said. Horses, mostly. Children are probably different. A little, Clara said, which was the most generously imprecise thing she'd said in 2 weeks, and she caught herself almost smiling at it, and then didn't, because there wasn't room for smiling yet. There was too much between here and the place where smiling made sense. It was mid-morning when she first noticed the other riders. 2 of them, far back. Not following closely enough to be coincidence, not close enough to be certain. She watched them for a long time before she said anything. She'd learned, in the past weeks, to verify what she thought she saw before speaking it out loud, because being wrong in front of people cost something she was no longer sure she could afford. We're being followed, she said finally. Ethan didn't turn to look. Since about 2 hours after we left Mill Haven, he said. She stared at him. You knew. Yes. And you didn't say anything. I was waiting to see what you'd notice. He said it without any condescension in it, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. 2 men. They're not pushing us. They're tracking. Goss's men. Most likely. Clara looked at Elsie, who was gnawing on the remaining stale biscuit with peaceful concentration. She thought about what it meant to be tracked. Not pursued, tracked, which was a different thing, more patient, and therefore more serious. She thought about Ethan saying Goss didn't forget. They're going to follow us to your ranch, she said. Yes. Which means they're going to know where you live. They already know where I live. He kept his voice even, his eyes forward. This is about something else. They want to know what I'm doing, why I bought you out, whether you told me something. Clara frowned. I didn't tell you anything. No, but Goss doesn't know that. He paused. Goss knows about your filing, the original, not the corrupted version. He knows the documents existed. If they're still out there, in your possession or someone else's, they're a problem for him. He took the documents, Clara said. His men took them from me on the road. All of them? She thought about the tin box. The way she'd packed it carefully in Columbus before they left. The papers organized by date. Thomas insisting they make copies because he'd grown up hearing his father talk about a land dispute that had gone wrong for lack of paperwork. Thomas and his careful, thorough, quietly methodical way of preparing for the future. Thomas, who had made copies, who had sent a copy to his brother in Denver, just in case. Clara looked at Ethan. Not all of them, she said slowly. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, he'd guessed, or something close to it. Then you have a case, he said. If your brother-in-law still has the copies, and if I can get my lawyer in Cheyenne to move fast enough. Thomas's brother doesn't know Thomas is dead, Clara said. She heard how that sounded. She'd heard how it sounded every time she thought it, which was a fact she had to live with. She hadn't been able to get word to Denver. She hadn't been able to get word to anyone. She'd been surviving too hard to tell anyone she was surviving. Ethan absorbed this. He'll find out, he said. That's fixable. Is it? Most things are, he said, and she couldn't tell if he believed it or if he was the kind of man who set it as policy, who decided somewhere along the way that it was better to operate as if things could be fixed, even when you weren't certain. She didn't ask which one. It didn't change the riders behind them. What do we do about them? She asked. Right now? Nothing. They're keeping distance. They're not going to move while there's nothing to gain from moving. He glanced sideways at her. When we reach the ranch, there are things they want that they can't take by force without consequence. 2 men against... He paused, calculated something she couldn't see. Against what I have there. They won't risk it. What do you have there? Clara asked. He was quiet for a moment. About 3 good horses, he said. A rifle I'm better with than most. And a neighbor who's been in worse situations than this and hasn't died yet. He paused again. Also a dog that's loud but largely useless in a fight. Clara looked at him. That's what we have. That's what we have, he agreed, without any apology in it. She looked forward again at the road ahead. She thought about what it meant to be in a situation where 3 horses and a rifle and a neighbor and a useless dog were what stood between you and the men behind you. She had grown up in a house with a father who worked in a printing office and came home smelling like ink, in a city where the conflicts that mattered were conducted in newspapers and courtrooms and the physical world held mostly still. She had come west with Thomas, who had been brave and careful and had died 40 yards from the barn in a February storm, and now she was here. What was your neighbor in? She asked. What worse situations? The war, Ethan said. and one or two things after. Will he help us? He'll help me. Help me. Whether he likes it is a different question. What will make him not like it? Ethan thought about it with his particular habit of actually thinking before answering. The fact that it's not my problem, he said finally. Walt has opinions about other people's problems. It became your problem when you bought our freedom, Clara said, and heard how that sounded, how strange the word bought was in that sentence, the fundamental wrongness of it that she still hadn't processed and wasn't going to process now, not in the middle of this road with two riders behind her and a sleeping child on her hip. It became my problem before that, Ethan said quietly. She looked at him. He didn't elaborate. He just looked at the road ahead, and she decided to let it go, at least for now. There were things she could push on and things she needed to leave alone, and she was getting better at knowing the difference. They reached the ranch at midday the following day, earlier than Ethan had predicted, because he'd pushed the pace slightly, and Clara hadn't complained, and Elsie had slept through most of the last 3 hours. The property announced itself gradually. A fence line first, then a line of cottonwoods that someone had planted deliberately along a shallow creek, then the shape of a barn, and beyond it a house, small and square, and built with the practical aesthetics of someone who cared more about function than appearance. Clara looked at it for a long moment. It was not impressive, but it was standing. After 2 weeks of not having anything stand, standing was enough. A man came out of the barn before they'd crossed the fence line. I was older than Ethan by 15 years at least, heavy through the shoulders, with a beard that had given up on any particular shape and hair that was in the process of deciding to leave. He watched them ride in with his arms crossed, and his expression arranged into something that was equal parts curiosity and preemptive irritation. Walt, Ethan said, dismounting. Ethan, Walt said. He looked at Clara. He looked at Elsie. He looked back at Ethan. You went to Mill Haven for 1 day. I was gone 2 days, Ethan said. 2 days, Walt repeated. He looked at the woman and child again. You bring back strays now? Walt, Ethan said, in a tone that wasn't warning exactly, more like the abbreviated language of two men who'd worked out which words were necessary and which weren't. Walt made a sound in the back of his throat that communicated several things at once: displeasure, resignation, and a grudging willingness to proceed. He looked at Clara directly for the first time, really looked, the assessing look of someone who'd seen a lot of tired people and was measuring her against his experience. You hurt? He asked. No, Clara said. Child? She's fine. She needs to eat and sleep. He nodded, the nod of someone who can work with fine and eat and sleep. House has a back room, he said, not to Clara, not exactly, more to the air between them. Stove's going. There's salt pork left from yesterday. He went back into the barn. That's welcome, Clara said. That's welcome, Ethan confirmed. The next 3 days were the first 3 days in a month that Clara spent in one place. She would not have described them as restful. She didn't have restful in her anymore, couldn't locate it. But they were still, and still was something. She slept in the back room on a cot that had seen better years. Elsie slept beside her on a folded blanket on the floor. And for the first time since Thomas died, the child slept without waking every hour, slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has finally been given enough warmth and food to stop being afraid. Clara lay awake and listened to her daughter breathe and rebuilt the list. She needed to get word to Denver, to Martin Whitmore, Thomas's brother, who had the copy of the land filing, who didn't know his brother was dead, who would need to know both things. She needed a lawyer, or access to a lawyer, which meant access to money, or someone with money, and a reason to help. She needed to understand what exactly Goss was doing, not the surface of it, which she had, but the depth, the names behind him, the men he was clearing land for, and the arrangement he had with the railroad and the county filing office. She needed, underneath all of that, to figure out what she wanted to happen. Not just survival. Not just justice, which was a word that started to sound thin the longer you needed it. Something more specific than either one. Some outcome that she could hold in her hands and say, this is what it was all for. She was still working out what that was when the trouble started. It came on the 4th morning, and it came in the form of a message, which was not what she expected. She'd expected the riders to make some kind of move, approach the property, issue a warning, do something that announced itself. Instead, she was in the main room of the house with Elsie when Ethan came in from outside with a folded piece of paper and his face arranged into the careful stillness of someone managing something. What is it? She asked. He handed it to her. It was short. 3 sentences. written in the clean, measured hand of someone educated, someone who'd made a habit of precision. It said, "Mr. Callahan, you have made a business decision that does not serve your interests. Return what you've taken, and we can discuss an arrangement beneficial to all parties." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Clara read it twice. She set it on the table. "He thinks I told you something," she said. "Yes." "He thinks you bought me because I have information that's useful to you." "Yes." "Did you?" she asked. "Did you know about the copies in Denver before you—" "No," Ethan said. "I didn't know anything about your specific situation before Millhaven. I knew what Goss was doing in general. I didn't know about you until I saw you." Clara looked at him. "Then what made you stop?" It was the question she'd been holding since the moment on the platform, the one she hadn't let herself ask because she'd been too busy surviving to afford the distraction of understanding. "You said you were passing through. You could have kept passing." He sat down at the table across from her. He looked at his hands for a moment, not dramatically, just the look of a man trying to find the right words by locating them in himself rather than in the air. "I've passed through a lot of places," he said. "I've seen a lot of things I didn't stop for. I made peace with most of it." He paused. "I couldn't make peace with that one." "Why not?" "Because you didn't look down," he said. "Every person I've seen in a situation like that, and I've seen more than I want to count, they all reach a point where they look down. It's not weakness. It's just what the body does when it's trying to protect itself from humiliation. But you didn't." He looked at her directly. "You were up there with nothing left and you didn't look down once." Clara felt something in her chest that she couldn't fully contain and didn't try to. She pressed her lips together and looked at the folded piece of paper on the table and then back at him. "I was looking for a way out," she said. "I wasn't being brave. I was looking for an exit." "I know," he said. "That's why it was worth stopping for." Walt appeared in the doorway from outside, with the abruptness of a man who'd been standing just outside it for a while. He looked at the note on the table. He looked at Ethan. He said, "So Goss is moving." "Apparently." "You knew this was coming." "I knew something was coming." Walt picked up the note and read it and set it back down. He looked at Clara with the frank assessment of a man revising his estimate of a situation. "The woman's the target," he said, not to her, to Ethan, which Clara found irritating enough to be useful. "I'm in the room," she said. Walt looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite respect, more the preliminary to it. "You're the target," he said, this time to her directly. "Goss doesn't care about Ethan beyond the fact that Ethan's inconvenient. You're what he needs, either to get rid of or to use. Depends on what you know." "She has a brother-in-law in Denver," Ethan said, "with copies of the original land filing." Walt absorbed this. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man doing actual arithmetic. "That's enough to open a case," he said, "if you get the right lawyer." "I know someone in Cheyenne," Ethan said. "You know everyone in Cheyenne," Walt said, with the tone of a man who had opinions about this. He looked at Clara again. "How fast can you get word to Denver?" "I don't know how to get word to Denver," Clara said. "I've been in the wilderness for 2 weeks. I don't have money. I don't have—" She stopped. She had been saying "I don't have" so many times in so many contexts that the phrase had started to feel like a permanent feature of herself, a defining characteristic rather than a temporary condition, and she was deeply tired of it. She straightened her back. "What would it take?" Walt and Ethan looked at each other with the brief fluency of men who've worked something out without words. "Ride her to Casper," Walt said. "Then telegraph from Casper to Denver. Casper's a day's ride. I can go." "I need someone here," Ethan said. "Obviously." Walt looked at him. "You going to be able to handle what's coming?" "I've handled Goss's men before." "You haven't had civilians before," Walt said, and looked at Clara with a kind of frank regret, as if he was sorry about the category she fell into. "I'm not a civilian," Clara said. "You're not a soldier," Walt said. "I kept my daughter alive for 2 weeks in conditions that would have killed half the men in this valley," Clara said, and she heard the flatness in her own voice, the complete absence of heat in it, which was somehow more serious than anger. "I'm not asking to fight your battles. I'm asking to know what's coming so I can make decisions about my own situation." The silence that followed was the kind that meant she'd said something that landed. Walt looked at Ethan. Ethan was looking at Clara with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something slightly more open than his usual steadiness, as if a door had moved on its hinge without fully opening. She needs to know, Ethan said, which wasn't agreement exactly, more like a statement of fact that also happened to agree. Walt sat down. For the next hour, he told her what he and Ethan had pieced together about Harlan Goss and the men behind him, a consortium of Eastern investors who'd identified the railroad corridor 2 years earlier and begun acquiring land through a combination of legitimate purchase and creative pressure. Goss was their instrument on the ground, and his method was efficient. Identify claims that could be challenged, manufacture the challenge, acquire the land at distressed prices from people who no longer had the legal standing or the resources to fight. The county filing office was the mechanism. A clerk named Teague, who'd been making $50 a month on a $20 salary and had recently developed a habit of correcting historical paperwork. The railroad deal was expected to close within 4 months. 4 months, Clara repeated. If we're going to move, we move now, Walt said. Goss knows that. That's why he's pushing. Clara thought about Thomas's copies in Denver in Martin's possession, unread, gathering dust in whatever room Martin kept things he meant to get back to. She thought about the lawyer in Cheyenne and what a lawyer could do in 4 months with the right documentation. She thought about Teague the clerk and $50 a month and a man who'd made a decision he was probably not entirely comfortable with. What happens to Teague, she said, if the original filings surface and his alterations come to light? Walt looked at her. He goes to jail, he said, or he runs. Or he talks, Clara said. Another silence. This one was different. This one had the quality of a room where someone has just opened a window that changes how all the air moves. Ethan was looking at her. He might talk, he said slowly, if someone gave him a reason to believe talking was safer than staying quiet. Who would give him that reason? Walt said. Someone who understood what he stood to lose, Clara said, and could explain the alternative clearly. She was not, she told herself, being brave. She was being practical. She was looking at a problem from the angle she'd been given and finding the line through it. The way she'd found lines through things her whole life. The way she'd kept Elsie alive for 2 weeks. Not by being fearless, but by being unwilling to accept that there was no path when there had to be one. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then, Casper, he said. Teague does filings twice a month in Casper. He'll be there in 9 days. Then we have 9 days, Clara said. Walt looked at her for a long time with the expression of a man updating a file he'd thought was complete. She's not a civilian, he said to Ethan. I know, Ethan said. She almost smiled at that. Almost. That night, after Elsie was asleep and Walt had gone to his quarters in the barn and the house had settled into its particular night sounds, Clara sat at the table with the lamp and wrote 2 letters. One to Martin Whitmore in Denver, explaining that Thomas was dead and what she needed and how fast she needed it. One to a name Ethan gave her in Cheyenne, a lawyer named Gideon Pratt, who had worked land claims for 15 years and had, according to Ethan, an almost personal resentment of fraud. She wrote them carefully and without wasting words, because she had learned that words were like everything else. You didn't spend them on what wasn't necessary. She sealed them and left them on the table for Walt to take in the morning. Then she sat for a while in the quiet with the lamp and the sound of the wind outside and the sound of Elsie breathing from the back room, and she thought about what Ethan had said on the platform. You don't have to carry the weight anymore. She wasn't sure she believed that yet. She wasn't sure she trusted it. Wasn't sure that the weight could be shared rather than simply transferred to someone who would eventually find it too heavy and set it down at the wrong moment. She had Thomas as evidence that even the people who meant to stay could be taken by a storm on a short walk between the house and the barn. But she also had this, a table with a lamp, 2 letters ready to send, a plan that was incomplete and risky and dependent on too many things she couldn't control, but a plan nonetheless. The first real plan she'd had in weeks. She had made it herself. That mattered. Whatever came next, that part was hers. She blew out the lamp and went to the back room and lay down beside her daughter, and for the second time in 4 nights, she slept. Outside, the Wyoming dark was total and wide and cold, and somewhere in it, 2 riders had made their camp and were waiting, patient in the way that men with backing and time on their side can afford to be patient. And they did not know yet that patience was not going to be enough. They did not know yet what was coming. Neither did Clara, not fully. But she was starting to. Walt left before dawn. Clara heard him go. The soft knock of the barn door, the low sound of a horse being let out rather than ridden out, the particular quiet of a man trying not to wake the house. She lay in the dark with Elsie warm against her side and listened to the hoofbeats fade north and felt the specific loneliness of watching a plan move into the world without you, of having set something in motion that you now had no control over. She had written these letters. Walt was carrying them. Martin Whitmore in Denver didn't know yet that his brother was dead. Gideon Pratt in Cheyenne didn't know yet that there was a case worth taking. Both of those facts were still traveling through darkness on horseback and wouldn't arrive for another day at least. And in the meantime, she was here in a borrowed back room with a sleeping child and 9 days until Teague showed up in Casper, and the thing she'd built in her head last night had to actually work. She got up before Elsie woke. The main room was cold. She built the fire the way Ethan had showed her, fast and low, and put water on. She sat at the table with the empty space where the letters had been and thought about the shape of what she was trying to do. Not the emotion of it. She'd had enough emotion to last considerable time, and she needed to set it aside and think clearly. The shape of it, the structure. She needed Teague to talk. For Teague to talk, he needed to believe that talking was safer than silence. For him to believe that, he needed to understand that the evidence against him already existed, and that staying quiet only protected Goss, not himself. She needed to put that in front of him in a way that gave him a door to walk through. The problem was that she couldn't be the one to put it in front of him. She was the woman whose land claim he'd helped destroy. He'd see her coming. He'd shut down or run to Goss before she got 2 sentences out. She needed someone he didn't know was connected to her. She was still turning this over when Ethan came in from outside with firewood and stopped when he saw her at the table. "You slept," he said. "Some," she said. "Sit down. I need to think out loud." He sat. She told him what she'd been working through. He listened without interrupting, which she'd already identified as one of the more useful things about him. The capacity to actually hear what someone was saying before deciding what he thought about it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Teague is cautious," he said. "He's not a man who makes quick decisions." "I know, which means whoever approaches him can't push. They have to plant something and leave." "Plant what?" "The idea that the documentation already exists and is in the hands of someone who knows what it means." She looked at him. "He doesn't need to be frightened. He needs to understand his situation accurately. Right now he thinks he's invisible. He needs to understand he's not." Ethan looked at the table. He picked up his coffee cup and turned it in his hands. "There's a man in Casper named Dills," he said slowly. "Ed Dills. He runs the feed and supply off the main road. He's been watching Goss's operation for 2 years because Goss pushed 2 of his neighbors off their land, people he'd known for 20 years, and he's the kind of man who nurses a grievance carefully and waits." He paused. "He's also the kind of man Teague would talk to. They know each other from county meetings." Clara looked at him. "Can you trust him?" "With most things." "With this?" Ethan thought about it. Really thought, not performing consideration. "Yes," he said. "With this." "Then we need to get to him before we get to Teague." "We," Ethan said, and it wasn't a challenge, just a notation. "I'm not waiting here," Clara said. "I have things to do in Casper. I need to see Teague myself, even if I don't approach him. I need to understand who I'm dealing with before I can know if this plan holds." Casper is a day's ride. The 2 men who've been watching the fence line, have they moved? Not yet. "Then they're still watching," Clara said. "Which means Goss doesn't know what we're planning, which means we have some time." Ethan looked at her for a moment with that particular expression she'd seen once or twice before, the one that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "You plan fast," he said. "I've been planning for 2 weeks," she said. "This is the first time I've had enough information to plan towards something real." They worked out the logistics at the table over the next hour. Walt had gone north to Casper by the main road with the letters. Ethan and Clara would take a different route, longer, more indirect, which Ethan knew by the kind of detailed memory that comes from years of scouting terrain rather than roads. They would leave the following morning before the watchers were fully awake. They would take Elsie, because leaving her was not a possibility Clara was prepared to discuss. "She'll slow us down," Ethan said. "Not cruel, just accurate." "I know," Clara said. "We leave with enough time to account for it." He nodded. That was all. She appreciated that he didn't argue a point once she'd answered it. The day between the decision and the departure was strange. Clara spent part of it going through Ethan's supplies with the systematic attention of someone inventorying what was actually available rather than what they wished was available. She found dried herbs in a tin near the stove, yarrow, she identified, and something she was less sure of, and dried willow bark. and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. She'd learned what she knew about plants and medicine from her mother's mother, a woman who'd kept a kitchen garden and a knowledge base that predated formal doctoring in their part of Ohio by several generations. It was the kind of knowledge that had seemed quaint when Clara was young and had since become the most practical thing she owned. She bundled what she needed and added it to their supplies. Ethan found her doing this and said nothing, which she'd come to understand was a form of communication. It meant he was noting something rather than commenting on it. "Do you know what you're doing with that?" he asked eventually. "Willow bark for fever or pain," she said. "Yarrow to slow bleeding if we need it." He looked at the yarrow bundle in her hand. "We might need it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm taking it." That evening, Elsie had a bad hour, the kind of hour toddlers have without warning, when something has shifted in their small internal weather and the world is suddenly wrong in every direction. She cried with the sustained intensity of someone with no internal filter on their distress, and Clara held her and walked the small room and talked to her in a low, steady voice, not saying anything in particular, just maintaining the sound of calm as a kind of infrastructure for the child to stand on. Ethan appeared in the doorway at one point. He stood there for a moment watching, then disappeared, and came back a few minutes later with something in his hand. A small wooden shape, rough cut, the suggestion of a horse. He held it out toward Elsie without any particular hope on his face, just the offering of it. Elsie looked at it through her tears with the focused assessment of a 2-year-old determining whether a thing was worth her attention. She reached out and took it, turned it over. The crying dropped from full volume to a kind of wet, diminishing hiccup. Clara looked at Ethan over the child's head. "I was bored last winter," he said, slightly defensive, which was the most human thing she'd heard him say. "Thank you," she said. He went back to the main room. Clara walked her daughter until the child fell asleep clutching the small wooden horse, and then lay her down on the blanket and sat beside her for a while in the dark, listening to the night outside, the wind and the land sounds, and somewhere far out, the low call of something she couldn't identify. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him specifically, not the shape of grief but the specific person, the way he organized his tools in the barn by size, the habit he had of reading the same paragraph twice before he turned the page, the sound of his voice when he was talking about something he cared about, which was different from his regular voice, fuller somehow. She let herself think about him for a while because she'd been too busy to do it properly, and she owed him that much. She owed him more than that, but it was what she had right now. Then she put him back in the place she kept him and thought about Casper. They left at first light. The route Ethan had chosen swung wide of the main road, cutting through terrain that was rougher but less visible, dry creek beds and ridge lines, and once a stretch of pine forest that smelled like cold and resin and something clarifying. Elsie rode in front of Clara, wedged between her arms, the wooden horse still in her fist. She was in good spirits in the way children can be when the adults around them are calm, and the movement is regular, and there's something interesting to look at. Ethan rode slightly ahead, his eyes doing their habitual sweep, and Clara found herself doing the same, reading the ground, reading the sight lines, noting where cover was and where it wasn't. She'd done this for 2 weeks without anyone to do it with, and the difference, she realized, was that alone she'd been cataloging dangers with no plan for responding to them. Now she was doing it with someone who had responses, and that changed the quality of the attention. It made it less like fear and more like work. They were 2 hours out when Ethan pulled up without warning. Clara stopped her horse beside him. She followed his sight line but saw nothing. "What?" she said quietly. "Rider," he said, moving fast, coming from the northeast. She looked again and found it. The movement against the slope of a distant ridge, small and hurrying, too purposeful to be someone passing through. Her first thought was that it was one of Goss's men, that they'd been spotted leaving, that something was moving faster than they'd planned. Ethan's expression was different from what she expected. "That's Walt's horse," he said. She looked again. She couldn't see it the way he could. She didn't have his years of reading distances, but she believed him, and the belief produced a cold feeling that went through her steadily because Walt had gone to Casper 2 days ago with the letters, and Walt coming back this fast meant something had happened. They pulled off the route and waited in the shadow of a ridge, and Walt came to them 15 minutes later, his horse blown and his face doing the thing faces do when a man has been riding hard and hasn't had time to compose himself yet. "Casper," he said before he'd fully stopped. "Goss is there. Not his men. Him." Personally. Ethan went still. That's not usual. No, he got there yesterday morning. He's meeting with someone from the railroad office. I saw them go into the hotel together. Walt looked at Clara. And there's something else. Your brother-in-law. Clara's breath stopped. Martin? He's there too. He arrived by stage yesterday afternoon. Walt's expression was complicated, the expression of a man delivering news that is bad in one way and significant in another, and he isn't sure which one leads. He got your letter, but that's not why he came. He came because he already knew Thomas was dead. The ground did something it hadn't done in a while, shifted under her, not literally, but in the way it had the day the writers came to the Whitmore claim, and she'd understood that the conversation was not what it appeared to be. He knew, she said. Someone wrote to him. He didn't say who. He had the copies of the filing. He'd taken them to a man in Denver who told him they were worth something. Walt paused. He came to sell them. The silence after that was thorough. Even the wind seemed to fall off for a moment. To whom? Clara said, and she heard how flat her voice was, how completely she'd flattened it down to stop other things from coming through. He'd been contacted, Walt said. He didn't know who by. Someone offered him money for the copies, made it sound like a legal settlement, straightforward, sign here and take the money and everyone moves on. He looked at her steadily. I don't know if he understood what he was actually selling. Did he sell them? Ethan asked. Not yet. He was supposed to meet with someone this morning. Walt looked at the sun, which was about 2 hours ago. Clara turned her horse toward the Casper Road. Clara, Ethan said. If he hasn't sold them yet, there's still time, she said. If he has... She stopped, because if he had, the entire structure she'd built in her head came apart. The lawyer in Cheyenne, the plan for Teague, the 4-month window, all of it collapsed back into nothing. She was not going to let herself finish that sentence until she had to. How far to Casper? 4 hours on this road, Walt said. 3 if you push. Then we push, she said. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he turned his horse and they rode. 3 hours was too long and also the fastest it could be done. Clara spent them in a kind of suspended state she'd been in before, the state of sustained forward motion toward a thing you can't yet see, where thinking helps up to a point and then stops helping, and the only thing left is the moving. Elsie felt the tension in her mother's body and went quiet, watching the landscape with the wide, careful eyes of a child reading adult weather. They came into Casper from the south, not the main road, Ethan's choice, and he took them through the back of the town along the alley line until they reached the livery where he apparently knew the man. A brief exchange and their horses were taken and they were on foot. The hotel is on the main road, Walt said. The Meridian. Goss was using the back dining room. Martin wouldn't know Goss by sight, Clara said. He'd be meeting with whoever Goss sent. A lawyer type, Walt said. Young, clean, dressed like money. I saw him with Goss the night before. Then Martin doesn't know who he's actually dealing with, Clara said. She was thinking fast, the particular speed of someone who knows the clock is running and has to work faster than the clock. Martin is Thomas's brother. He's not a bad man. He didn't know Thomas was dead, and he didn't understand what he was selling. She heard herself making the most generous possible interpretation of a situation that had a less generous version available, and she made herself sit with both versions for a moment. Martin had been contacted by someone. He'd been offered money. He'd come to sell something that belonged, if it belonged to anyone, to Thomas's estate, which meant to Clara and Elsie. She put the less generous version down. It didn't help her right now, and she could pick it back up later. Can you get me into the hotel without going through the front? She asked Ethan. Side door off the kitchen, he said. I've been in this building before. Of course you have, Walt said. They went in through the kitchen, which involved a brief and professional exchange with a cook, who clearly recognized Ethan and was not particularly surprised by any part of the situation, which told Clara something about the kind of history Ethan Callahan had in this town. Through the kitchen and into a hallway, and then Ethan stopped her with a hand on her arm. Not grabbing, just the lightest possible pressure. And she stopped. She could hear voices from the room at the end of the hall. 2 of them. One she didn't recognize, smooth and even, the voice of someone who'd been trained to make things sound reasonable. The other she recognized instantly, even after more than a year, because Martin Whitmore had a way of speaking that was almost identical to Thomas's, and the recognition of it hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. She collected herself. 1 breath. Then she walked to the end of the hall and opened the door. Martin was sitting at a table with a stack of papers in front of him and a pen in his hand, and the young man across from him, clean, dressed like money, exactly as Walt had described, was saying something smooth and concluding, the way people speak when they're one signature away from the thing they came for. Both of them looked up when the door opened. Martin Whitmore had Thomas's coloring and none of Thomas's patience. He was 32, heavy-set, with a tendency to speak before he thought that Thomas had once described as his brother's most reliable characteristic. He looked at Clara, and his face went through four things in rapid succession: surprise, relief, guilt, and something that wanted to be defensiveness but couldn't quite get there with her standing in the doorway looking at him the way she was looking at him. "Clara," he said. "How did you—" "Don't sign that," she said. The young lawyer type across the table made a smooth recovery. "Ma'am, this is a private transaction between—" "It's not a private transaction," Clara said. She was looking at Martin, not at the other man. "Martin, look at what you're about to sign. Read the name on the receiving documentation." Martin looked down at the papers in front of him. He was not a fast reader, never had been. Thomas had mentioned it more than once with the particular fond exasperation of a brother. And he went through the document more slowly than Clara wanted, but she didn't push him. She stood in the doorway and let him read and waited. She watched the moment he found it. His face changed. "Goss Land Holdings," he said, and looked up. "Harlan Goss," Clara said. "He's the man who pushed me off the Whitmore claim. He had your brother's original filing corrupted in the county record. He had his men take the documents from me on the road and leave me with nothing. And now someone contacted you offering to buy the copies." She held his gaze. "Who contacted you, Martin?" Martin looked at the man across the table. The man across the table was doing the professional thing, the thing where you maintain composure and wait for the situation to resolve in one direction or another. But something had shifted in his face at the mention of Goss. He'd expected a transaction, not this. "A letter," Martin said. "Said it was a legal settlement on behalf of the Whitmore estate. Said Clara had approved it." He stopped. I know I should have verified. "You didn't know Thomas was dead when you were contacted," Clara said, and made herself say it cleanly, without the weight of everything else behind it. It wasn't entirely fair to him, but it was accurate enough to work with. Someone used that. They knew Thomas was dead and you didn't, and they used it. "Mrs. Whitmore." The young man across the table found his voice. "Whatever you believe about the origins of this offer, the transaction is legal. Your brother-in-law has the right to sell documentation he possesses. He has the right to sell his own property," Clara said. "Not mine. Those copies were made from my husband's original filing, which was filed in my name and his jointly. Half of what Martin is holding belongs to my daughter." She walked to the table and picked up the top document and looked at the young man directly. "I want to know who sent you, not Goss. Whoever is above Goss. The investment group." The young man's face went through something brief and quickly controlled. "I represent legal interests." "You represent people who are going to have a significant problem in approximately 4 weeks," Clara said. "When a lawyer named Gideon Pratt in Cheyenne files a formal challenge to the county land record on behalf of 12 families. At which point this documentation," she held up the papers, "becomes evidence in a case rather than a transaction in a hotel room." She set the papers down. "Who sent you?" The silence stretched. Ethan had appeared in the doorway behind her. She could feel him there without turning, the specific gravity of someone standing somewhere. The young man looked at Ethan. He looked at Walt behind Ethan. He looked at Clara. He was calculating. She could see it, the professional calculation of someone weighing exposure against instruction, and she watched him arrive at the conclusion that his instructions hadn't covered this, and he was now operating without a net. "Patterson," he said finally. "Elias Patterson. He's the primary partner." Clara filed the name away. "Thank you," she said, which was not something she felt but was the correct thing to say to a man who had just given you what you needed. "You can go." He went. He went with a speed that told her he was going directly to report this conversation, which was fine, which was what she wanted, because now Goss and Patterson knew that the documentation was not available and that someone had connected the dots and was moving. And men who knew they were being moved against had a different kind of pressure on them than men who thought they were invisible. Pressure made people make mistakes. Martin was looking at her. "Clara," he said. "Thomas. How—" "February," she said. "A storm." He went out to check on the horses. She said it the way she'd learned to say it, flat and clean, the way you carry something very heavy by holding it close to your body and not swinging it. He didn't come back. Martin put his face in his hands for a moment. It was the most honest thing she'd seen anyone do in weeks, that brief surrender to something unmanageable, and she stood beside him and let him have it. "I'm sorry," he said into his hands. "I know," she said. He pulled himself back together in the way men do, the particular reconstruction of composure that never quite sets right, but is necessary. He looked at the papers. "What do you need from me?" "The copies," she said, "and a statement from you explaining how you were contacted, when, and by whom, who wrote to you and what they said." "That implicates me," he said. "It implicates whoever wrote to you," she said. "You were deceived. A statement saying so, signed and witnessed, protects you and gives us what we need." He looked at her for a long moment. She recognized something in his face, the same thing she'd seen in his brother's face when Thomas made a decision he was scared of but knew was right. The specific expression of someone who has found the line between what they want to do and what they have to do and is choosing the latter. "All right," he said. She borrowed paper from the hotel desk, and Martin wrote his statement with the slow, deliberate hand of a man who knew this would be read carefully. And when he was done, Ethan witnessed it, and Walt witnessed it, and Clara folded it and put it in her coat with the original copies of the land filing. She had more now than she'd had an hour ago, more than she'd had 3 weeks ago when she was standing on the road with nothing. But they were standing in the middle of Casper, and Goss was somewhere in this town, and the young lawyer who'd just been turned away was somewhere in this town, and the clock had moved. It was Ethan who felt it first. He'd been watching the window that looked onto the street, his eyes doing their habitual reading of everything visible. And something in his posture changed, the small change of a man who has seen what he was looking for and is now making fast calculations about it. "We need to move," he said quietly. Clara looked at the window. Through the glass she could see the main road, the usual midday traffic of a frontier town, and nothing that looked like danger except Harlan Goss was crossing the road toward the hotel. He was not hurrying. I was walking with the measured, patient stride of a man who had all the time he needed and knew it, and he had 2 men with him, bigger than she remembered from the morning they'd come to the claim, or maybe she was just seeing them differently now that she understood more about what they were. "Back way," Ethan said. He was already moving. Clara grabbed Martin's arm. "Come with us." "I can't just—" "Martin," she said, and something in her voice put it outside discussion, and he came. They went back the way they'd come, through the hallway and the kitchen, and the cook who didn't look up this time, and out the side door into the alley and moving before the door had fully closed behind them. Claire's mind was running the geometry of it. Goss entering the front of the hotel, the route he'd take through it, how long before he reached the back dining room and found it empty. 4 minutes. Maybe 5. "Horses," Ethan said. "Martin doesn't have a horse," Walt said. "I came by stage," Martin confirmed, slightly breathless, which was the least useful information available. "He rides with me," Ethan said. He looked at Clara. "Can you manage?" "Yes," she said. She had Elsie on her hip and the documents in her coat, and she was moving through an alley in Casper, Wyoming, while a man who had destroyed her life was 90 seconds behind her, and the word yes was the most accurate thing she could say, because she could manage and she was going to manage, and there was no other option that she was willing to consider. The livery was 2 blocks, and they covered it fast, Walt going ahead to get the horses, and when they got there, the horses were ready because Walt had the gift of making things ready faster than seemed possible. Martin was put up behind Ethan with the graceless urgency of a large man being asked to move quickly without preparation, and Clara swung up with Elsie and felt her daughter grip the saddle horn with both hands, with the focused competence of a child who'd been on horses enough to know what to do. They came out of the livery onto the side street and headed south, back the way they'd come. And Clara did not look back at the main road and did not look for Goss because looking for him was not the point and never had been. The point was forward. The point was always forward. A mile out of town, Ethan pulled to a slower pace and let the horses settle, and the urgency shifted into something different. Not calm, not yet, but the managed state after urgency, when your body is still running fast and your mind is starting to catch up. "He saw us leave," Walt said. "Probably," Ethan said. "Then he knows we were there." "He knows we were there," Ethan confirmed. "He knows the transaction didn't happen. He knows we have the copies." He paused. "He's going to move faster now." Clara listened to this and held Elsie steady and thought about what faster meant. It meant the 9-day window to Teague was gone. It meant Goss was no longer watching and waiting. She'd taken the patience out of it when she'd walked through that hotel room door, and she'd known she was taking it out of it, had weighed that against the alternative of letting Martin sign the documents, and had made her choice. She'd made the right choice, but it came with a cost. "How fast will he move?" she asked. "By tonight he'll know where we are," Ethan said. "He already knows the ranch. He'll know we're heading back there." "Then we don't go back," she said. Ethan looked at her. "The ranch is a fixed point," she said. "He knows it. We go back there. We're where he expects us. We're waiting for something to happen to us." She was thinking as she spoke, the plan assembling itself from the pressure of necessity, which was the only way she'd ever made plans that actually held. "Teague is in Casper. Not 9 days from now. He's here now because Goss came early, which means Goss needed Teague here." Ethan went still with the particular stillness of someone putting two things together. "The filing," he said. "Goss was going to have Teague finalize the corruption of the Whitmore filing. With the original documents purchased from Martin, it would have been airtight." "But we have the documents," Clara said, "which means Teague is in Casper with no purpose except to be a liability." Clara looked at him. "Where would Goss put a man he doesn't want seen?" Ethan thought for a moment. "There's a boarding house east of the main road," he said. "Quiet. Goss's men have used it before." "Then we find Teague before Goss finds us," Clara said. "Not to pressure him, not to threaten him." She shifted Elsie on her hip and felt the child's small, warm weight and the wooden horse pressing against her ribs where Elsie was clutching it. "We show him what we have and we give him the door. That's all. The rest is his choice." Walt looked at Ethan. "She's doing it again," he said. "I know," Ethan said. "She's going to get us killed, or she's going to win this thing," Walt said, and something in his voice had moved past preemptive irritation and arrived at something that was, if not enthusiasm, at least the neighbor of it. "I'm aware of both possibilities," Clara said. "So are we," Ethan said, and turned his horse east. The boarding house was a narrow two-story building that smelled of wood smoke and old grease, and the woman who ran it looked at them with the expression of someone who had seen everything and was no longer surprised by anything, which turned out to be exactly what they needed. Ethan asked his question with the directness of someone who'd learned that this particular woman responded to directness and wasted her time with anything else. She answered it with a room number. Teague was on the second floor. Clara went up alone. Ethan's suggestion that she take him with her was acknowledged and set aside, because what she was about to do required a specific quality of approach that an additional person would complicate. She'd explained this to him in 4 words. He needs one person. And he'd looked at her for a moment and then stepped back. She knocked on the door and waited. The man who opened it was not what she'd pictured. She'd built up Teague in her mind during the weeks since she'd lost her documents, had made him into something larger and more deliberate than a man who traded in altered paperwork, had made him the face of everything. But what she found was a small, thin man of around 50, with the posture of someone accustomed to sitting at a desk, and frightened eyes, and the look of a person who'd been sitting in this room for 2 days knowing something was wrong and not having anyone to tell. He looked at her. He looked at the door behind her. "I'm alone," she said. "My name is Clara Whitmore. You altered my land filing." He tried to close the door. She put her hand on it. Not hard, just present. "I'm not here to threaten you," she said. "I'm here because you're in a worse position than you realize, and I'm the only person in this town right now who has a reason to help you." He didn't open the door wider, but he stopped pushing it closed. "Harlan Goss came to Casper to have you finalize a filing," she said. "That filing is now going to be challenged in court by a lawyer in Cheyenne who has the original documentation and a statement from a witness explaining how the corruption occurred." She kept her voice even, the voice she used when she was explaining something to someone who needed to hear it clearly. "When that happens, the altered record will be evidence, and the man who altered it will be the most visible person in the case." Teague's face was doing something complex and unhappy. "Goss will not protect you," she said. "That's not a guess. That's what men like Goss do when things go wrong. They find the nearest person below them and they point. You know that. You've known it the whole time you've been doing this." He was quiet for a long moment. The hallway smelled like old grease and someone's supper cooking somewhere below, and it was the most ordinary smell in the world, and Clara stood in it and waited with the patience of someone who'd run out of urgency and found that stillness was what remained. "What do you want?" Teague said finally. "A written account," she said. "Names, dates, instructions received, Specifically, who directed you to alter the Whitmore filing and when, and what you were paid. That puts me in prison, he said. It puts Goss in prison, she said, and Patterson. You're the mechanism, not the architect. A man who cooperates with a formal investigation is treated differently than a man who waits to be found. She looked at him steadily. You've been sitting in this room for 2 days knowing something was wrong. You already know which way this is going. The door opened. He let her in. She sat across from him at the small table by the window while he wrote, and the afternoon light came through the dusty glass and lay across the papers. And she watched his hand move and thought about Thomas filing their original claim with the same careful, deliberate hand, preparing for a future he was not going to live to see. And she thought about Elsie downstairs with Ethan and the wooden horse. And she thought about the lawyer in Cheyenne and the 4 months in the railroad. Teague wrote for 40 minutes. He wrote more than she expected. Not just the Whitmore filing, but 6 others, 6 other families, names and dates and amounts, the full ledger of what he'd done. When he finished, his hands were shaking slightly, and he put the pen down and looked at the pages like he didn't entirely recognize them. What happens to me now? He said. That depends on what you do next, she said honestly. But you have something now that you didn't have this morning. You have documentation that you cooperated willingly. That matters. She took the pages and folded them carefully and put them with the other documents in her coat. She had, in the space of 1 afternoon in Casper, gone from nearly losing everything to holding more than she'd started with. Not enough yet. Not finished. But real and provable and in her hands. She stood up and thanked him because manners were the infrastructure of things, and went downstairs to where Ethan was standing with Elsie asleep against his shoulder, the wooden horse still in the child's fist, and Walt was watching the door with the expression of a man who has been waiting and is relieved the waiting is done. We need to ride, she said. What did you get? Ethan asked. She patted the inside of her coat. Everything, she said, and even as she said it, she knew it wasn't quite true, knew there was still Goss and Patterson and the 4 months and a lawyer in Cheyenne who didn't know yet how much he had to work with. But it was enough. It was the most enough she'd had since February. Ethan looked at her with that expression she'd started to recognize, the one that lived between steadiness and something warmer. And he shifted Elsie carefully to give her back to Clara. And Clara took her daughter and settled her weight and felt the familiar burden of it, and did not, for the first time in a long while, feel entirely alone in carrying it. They went out into the afternoon and rode south toward whatever came next. The ride south out of Casper was quiet, in the way that follows action rather than precedes it, a different quality of quiet from what Clara had known on the road from Mill Haven. That silence had been the silence of 2 strangers with nothing established between them. This one had weight and history in it, 3 weeks of accumulated crisis compressed into something that rode alongside them, like a 4th person. Martin Whitmore rode behind Ethan and said nothing for the first hour, which Clara appreciated. She'd known Martin for 5 years, had watched him at holiday tables and summer gatherings, had understood him as a man who filled silence with words the way some people fill space with furniture, not because the words were necessary, but because the quiet made him uncomfortable. That he was holding it now told her something about what he was carrying. She wasn't ready to deal with Martin yet. She had the documents in her coat and Teague's written account, and the name Elias Patterson filed somewhere specific in her mind, and she needed to hold all of that carefully for a while before she could afford to attend to anything else. Ethan pulled alongside her after they cleared the last outlying buildings of Casper. Goss will know within the hour, he said. He may already know, she said. The man from the hotel room will have gone to him. Then we don't have tonight, Ethan said. He'll move on the ranch. Walt, riding on her other side, made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement. He'll want the documents first, Walt said. He can't move until he knows where they are. He knows where they are, Clara said. They're on me. And he knows where we're going. Then he'll wait for us at the ranch, Ethan said. Not alarmed, stating the geometry of it the way he stated most things, plainly, so they could work with it. Or he'll have men there when we arrive. Clara thought about the ranch. The small square house, and the cottonwoods along the creek, and the barn where Walt slept, and the back room where she'd lain awake rebuilding her list. She'd been there less than a week, but it had started to take on the specific gravity of a place where things matter, the gravity that she associated with the word home, and that she hadn't felt since she'd been on her own claim with Thomas. How many men does Goss have in the territory? She asked. Depends on the job, Ethan said. He travels light usually, but he knows we've been moving and building something. After today, he'll know how much. He'll call in more. From where? Casper, maybe Cheyenne. He paused. He has money. Money buys men. How long before they arrive? If he sends for them tonight, 2 days, maybe less. Clara worked the arithmetic. 2 days. Gideon Pratt in Cheyenne had her first letter, but nothing else yet. He didn't know about Teague's account, didn't know about Patterson's name, didn't know the full scope of what they'd built in a single afternoon in Casper. He couldn't file anything meaningful without the full documentation, and the full documentation was in her coat, and she was 2 days' ride from Cheyenne herself. I need to get to Cheyenne, she said. That's a hard ride, Walt said. 2 days south. I know how far it is. With the child, I know, she said. Not sharp, just definitive. She'd been calculating Elsie into every movement for 3 weeks, and she didn't need it named. Elsie could make the ride if they were careful about rest and pace, and didn't push the way they'd pushed coming into Casper. It wasn't ideal. Most of what was available to her wasn't ideal, and she'd stopped waiting for ideal sometime in February. Martin spoke up from behind Ethan. I can take the child, he said. Clara turned in her saddle to look at him. He met her eyes with an expression that was trying to be useful and was also trying to manage his own guilt. And the two things were fighting each other on his face and making him look younger than 32. I came by stage from Denver, he said. I can take the stage back. I can take Elsie with me. You want me to send my daughter to Denver, Clara said. I want to do something that helps, Martin said. I nearly destroyed what you were building. I didn't know what I was doing, but I nearly did it. Let me do something. He paused. She'd be safe in Denver. She'd be with family. You could move faster. Clara looked at her daughter, who was awake now, watching the horizon with the placid attention she gave to things she found interesting and couldn't yet name. The wooden horse was in her fist as it had been since last night. She'd stopped noticing she was holding it. The practical part of Clara's mind, the part that had kept them alive for 3 weeks on the strength of clear-eyed assessment, said that Martin was right. Elsie would be safe. Clara could move faster. 2 days to Cheyenne with a toddler was 2.5 days with regular stops and contingencies, and she couldn't afford the contingencies. The rest of her said something that wasn't articulable as an argument, just as a fact of her body. She had not been separated from her daughter since Thomas died, and she was not going to start now. No, she said. Martin looked at her. No, she said again, which was not more explanation but was more certain, and Martin understood the difference because Thomas had been his brother, and certainty in that family had a particular sound. All right, he said. They rode on. The plan that assembled itself over the next 2 hours was built from available materials, which was the only way plans got built out here, and it had the incomplete quality of something made under time pressure from what was at hand. Ethan would ride to Cheyenne, not Clara, because Ethan knew Gideon Pratt personally and could communicate the urgency in a way a letter couldn't. He would take the documents and Teague's account and everything else and get them to Pratt and stay in Cheyenne long enough to make sure the filing moved. Walt would take Clara and Elsie back to the ranch by the long route, the indirect one, arriving after dark and checking the approach before they came in. Martin would catch the eastbound stage from the crossroads town of Benton, which was south of where they were and out of Goss's immediate territory. It was a plan that split them up, which none of them liked, and that depended on timing they couldn't control, which none of them liked, and it was what they had. Clara did not like handing the documents to anyone. She stood on the road with the folded papers in her hands and understood with complete clarity that these pieces of paper were the only material substance of everything she'd built in 3 weeks, the only thing that converted her experience and her planning and the risks she'd taken into something a court could look at. Handing them to another person, even a person she'd come to trust more than she'd expected to trust anyone this quickly, required a specific act of will. She handed them to Ethan. He took them and put them inside his coat with the deliberate care of someone who understands what he's holding. I'll wire from Cheyenne when Pratt has them, he said. Where do I receive the wire? Benton has a telegraph office. Small, but it works. He looked at her. 2 days? Maybe 3? Then I'll be in Benton in 2 days, she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd stopped trying to categorize, the one that lived in the space between steadiness and something that had warmth in it, but hadn't decided what to do with the warmth yet. Be careful, he said, which was not the kind of thing Ethan Callahan said casually, and she understood it wasn't casual. You too, she said. He turned his horse south and rode. She watched him go for longer than was strictly necessary, and then she turned to Walt, who was watching her with the expression of a man who has noted something and is choosing not to comment on it, which was the most considerate thing she'd seen Walt do. "The long route," she said. "The long route," he agreed. Martin left them at the Benton Crossroads, which they passed through an hour later. He was awkward about it in the way of a man who wants to say the right thing and can't locate it. He stood with his hat in his hands and looked at Elsie and said, "She looks like Thomas." His voice did something in the middle of it that he controlled before it could go further. "She does," Claire said. "I'm sorry," he said, and she understood this meant several things at once, and she didn't try to separate them. "Right when you're back in Denver," she said, "I'll need you to be reachable when this goes to a formal hearing." He nodded, relieved to have something concrete. "I'll be there. Whatever you need." He caught the stage north and they watched it go, and then Walt turned them southwest toward the ranch, and the afternoon began its slow collapse into evening around them, the light going sideways and the air going cold. The way Wyoming evenings did, like the land was reminding you of its nature. They came to the ranch after dark. Walt stopped them half a mile out, in the shadow of a tree line, and they sat for 20 minutes watching the property. No lights that shouldn't be there. No horses that shouldn't be there. The barn looked undisturbed. The house was dark, which was correct. They'd left it dark. "I'll go first," Walt said. "I'll come with you," Clara said. "You'll stay with the child," he said, and something in his voice had the weight of someone who wasn't going to argue about this particular thing. She recognized that weight. She'd used it herself. She stayed. Walt rode in slow and came back 10 minutes later with the clear face of a man who hasn't found what he was looking for. "Empty," he said. "But someone's been here." Clara felt it before he finished. "How do you know?" "Gate was latched wrong," he said. "I latch it left-handed. It was latched right." She filed this. Someone had come and looked and left, which meant they were watching and waiting and had the patience to do it. Which meant Goss was playing a longer game than the urgency of the afternoon had suggested. He hadn't moved on the ranch because the ranch wasn't the point. The documents were the point. And the documents were now on their way to Cheyenne, on the back of a cavalry scout who knew how to move through territory without being seen. She held on to that. They settled into the ranch and the routine of it, and the next 2 days had a strange suspended quality, the quality of a held breath. Walt did the things that needed doing around the property and kept his rifle closer to hand than usual without making a show of it. Clara did what she could to keep Elsie's days normal, or as normal could be in a house that wasn't theirs, in a situation that was still unresolved, with an uncertainty that she was managing by giving it less of her attention than it was asking for. She was good at that by now, giving things less attention than they were asking for. On the second afternoon, a rider came to the property. Not one of Goss's men, a boy, maybe 15, from one of the neighboring homesteads to the east. He came with the slightly self-important air of someone who has been given a message and knows it matters, and he delivered it to Walt, who brought it to Clara. A woman named Ruth Farley wanted to speak with her. "Who is Ruth Farley?" Clara asked. Walt's expression did something complicated. "She's been in this valley for 12 years, he said. "Her husband died 4 years ago. She runs their original claim herself, about 8 miles east. She's—" He paused in the way of a man choosing his words carefully for once. "She's the person in this valley who knows things." "What things?" "Most things," he said. Clara went. Ruth Farley was 61 years old and had the hands of someone who'd been working land for 4 decades, and the eyes of someone who'd been watching people for longer than that. Her house was small and extremely ordered, the order of a person who lives alone and has developed specific systems for everything and finds comfort in the systems. She gave Clara coffee without asking whether she wanted it, which Clara had come to understand as a form of respect rather than presumption. It meant Ruth Farley had already assessed her and determined she was someone who needed coffee and could use it. "You stirred things up," Ruth said. She wasn't accusing. She was observing. "Things needed stirring," Clara said. "They did," Ruth agreed. "Goss has been moving on this valley for 2 years and none of us has been able to do anything about it, because none of us had what you apparently now have." She looked at Clara directly, the look of someone who doesn't have time for circumspection. "I have 7 neighbors who've lost claims. 2 families who are living on my property right now because they have nowhere else to go. And I have been watching Harlan Goss ride through this country like it belongs to him for long enough that I am extremely motivated to help you." Clara set down her coffee cup. What kind of help? The kind that shows up in court, Ruth said. Statements from 7 families, documented dates of claim disruptions. One family kept records, wrote down every visit from Goss's men, every threat, every implied deadline. Been doing it for a year. She looked at Clara with something that was almost satisfaction. I told them to. I told them if we ever got the chance, paperwork would matter. Clara looked at her. I've been waiting, Ruth said simply, for someone who knew what to do with it. They spent 3 hours at Ruth's table going through the documentation that 7 families had produced over 2 years. The accumulated evidence of a systematic dispossession that was more thorough than Clara had understood. Goss wasn't just clearing individual claims. He was working a grid, methodically moving across the valley from east to west, pushing families out of the railroad corridor in sequence. Teague's alterations at the county filing office were the legal mechanism, but Goss's men on the ground were the pressure, and the pressure had a pattern that was visible now in Ruth's paperwork in a way it hadn't been when each family was experiencing it alone. This needs to go to Cheyenne, Clara said. I know, Ruth said. That's why I sent for you. I'm expecting a wire in Benton tomorrow, Clara said. When I hear from Cheyenne, I need to send all of this south immediately. I'll have writers ready, Ruth said. Clara looked at her. Ruth Farley had been in this valley for 12 years and had been building something in secret, building it with patience and with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has been waiting for the right moment and knows that moments don't come to those who stop preparing for them. You've been doing this for a while, Clara said. Someone had to, Ruth said. I just didn't know when it would matter. She looked at Clara with an expression that was not sentimental, but had something warm beneath it, the warmth of someone who has been waiting alone for a long time and is glad to find they haven't been waiting for nothing. I didn't expect the someone would come from an auction block. Neither did I, Clara said. She rode back to the ranch in the early evening with Ruth's documents added to what she was carrying, and that night she sat at Ethan's table with Elsie asleep in the back room and Walt reading by the stove, and she laid out everything she had and looked at the shape of it. 7 families' statements, 2 years of documented disruption, Teague's written account naming Goss directly and Patterson behind him, the original Whitmore filing, and the copies Martin had carried from Denver. A lawyer in Cheyenne who had a personal grudge against fraud, and if Ethan had reached him, everything he needed to file a formal challenge to the county land record. It was more than she'd had at any point. It was possibly enough. She was still sitting with it when the knock came at the door. Walt was up and at it before she could move, rifle in hand, the speed of a man who had lived his life in conditions where a knock after dark carried a range of meanings. He opened it with his body to the side of the frame in the particular way of someone who'd learned that from experience rather than instruction. It was not Goss's men. It was a boy from Benton, 14 years old, with a telegraph message folded in his fist, and the self-serious expression of someone who'd been paid to deliver something important and intended to do it right. Walt took it and handed it to Clara without looking at it. She opened it. It was from Ethan. 4 lines. Pratt has the documents. Filing begins tomorrow morning. Patterson known to Pratt. Previous case. Come to Cheyenne when safe. Clara read it twice. She folded it and held it in her hands for a moment. Good news, Walt said. Not a question. Good news, she confirmed. He went back to his chair by the stove and picked up his reading, and that was the whole of it, which was exactly the right amount. But the morning brought Goss. He came at first light with 4 men, which was more than Clara had expected, and exactly as many as she'd been afraid of. She heard them before she saw them. The horses on the road approaching the property without the caution of men trying to be subtle, which meant they'd stopped caring about subtlety, which meant they'd decided the time for patience was over. Walt was already up. She heard him moving in the main room when she came out of the back room with Elsie, and he had his rifle and a look on his face that was not alarmed but was very focused, the focus of a man narrowing down to what was necessary. How many? She said. 5 counting Goss, he said. They're on the road, not in the yard yet. They're going to come in, she said. Yes, he said. Walt. She made him look at her directly. We don't fight them. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has a different opinion about this. We can't win a physical confrontation with 5 men, she said. We don't need to. Pratt is filing this morning. The documents are in Cheyenne. Fighting them here gives Goss something he can use. Self-defense. Resisting lawful inquiry. Whatever story he wants to tell. She shifted Elsie on her hip. We let them in. We talk to them. We tell them exactly what's been filed and where. And if that doesn't stop them, then we deal with what comes next, she said. But right now, knowing what we know and letting them know that we know it, that's our position. That's stronger than a rifle. Walt looked at his rifle. He looked at her. He put the rifle down on the table, within reach, but down. Talk first, he said. Talk first, she agreed. Harlan Goss knocked on the door. He knocked with the same measured patience he'd had on the morning he came to the Whitmore claim. The patience of a man who believes he has all the time and weight he needs. Clara opened it herself. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has done a great deal of arithmetic and arrived at a conclusion he's comfortable with. He was as she remembered him, clean coat, watch chain, the presentation of a man who'd decided long ago that appearing reasonable was more effective than appearing dangerous. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I think it's time we spoke directly. I agree, she said, and stepped back from the door. He came in. 2 of his men came with him. The other 2 stayed with the horses. He looked at the room, Walt at the table, Elsie on Clara's hip, the emptiness where Ethan would have been. And he made his calculation visibly, the calculation of a man assessing what he's dealing with. You've been busy, he said. Yes, Clara said. You have documents, he said, copies of a filing, a statement from a county clerk. He said it the way you name things you want diminished, giving them their label without their weight. And you've sent them south. To Gideon Pratt in Cheyenne, Clara said, who is filing a formal challenge to the Wyatt County land record this morning on behalf of 8 families, using documentation that includes a written account from Edward Teague detailing the specific alterations made to recorded claims and on whose instruction they were made. She watched his face while she said this. The face was controlled but not completely. Something moved in it at Teague's name, something involuntary. He also names Elias Patterson as the directing partner in the investment group. Goss was quiet for a moment. Teague's account is the word of a man who is already engaged in illegal activity, he said. It won't hold up as primary evidence. It's corroborating evidence, Clara said. The primary evidence is the original filing documentation and the comparison between it and the altered county record. Teague's account explains the mechanism. Patterson's involvement is established through financial records that Pratt already has from a previous case. She held his gaze. You can't undo what's been filed. You can't retrieve what's in Cheyenne. What you could do, and what I'm suggesting, is make a decision about where you stand and what comes next. He looked at her for a long moment. That almost sounds like an offer, he said. It's an observation, she said. You're an instrument in this, same as Teague. Patterson is above you. When this case resolves, and it will resolve against the investment group, the question is which names are prominent and which are cooperative. She was saying this not because she had any particular desire to offer Goss an exit, but because it was the most useful available pressure, and she'd learned to use what was useful regardless of how she felt about it. Patterson's name is in the filing. Yours doesn't have to be the only other one. Goss looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the measured patience, something different, something more direct. He was recalculating, she could see it, and the calculation was taking longer than his previous ones had. You know what you are? He said, and his voice was different too, less performed. You're the most inconvenient woman I have encountered in 20 years of doing business in this territory. I know, Clara said. One of his men shifted near the door and Walt's hand moved to the table, close to but not touching the rifle, and Goss saw it and held up one hand in the brief gesture of a man managing his own people. The man stilled. The filing is done, Goss said, and she understood he was no longer talking to her. He was talking to himself, the internal statement of a man arriving at a fact he can't alter. Patterson will distance himself. That's what Patterson does. Yes, Clara said, which leaves me as the most visible party. Unless you provide information that shifts that, Clara said. She kept her voice even, kept every other thing out of it. Pratt will have submitted the challenge by midday. After that, the formal investigation opens. There's a window before that investigation issues its first summons when a voluntary statement from a cooperative party carries considerably more weight than anything provided afterward. Goss was quiet for a long time, long enough that she heard Elsie make a small sound against her shoulder and felt her daughter's weight settle differently, the shifting of a child who is getting tired of being held. If I provide a statement, Goss said slowly, I need something in writing from Pratt, Something that acknowledges my cooperation. I can wire Pratt this morning, Clara said. Before I say anything further, I need that wire. Then let's go to Benton, she said. It was possibly the strangest hour she had spent in the entire 3 weeks. She rode to the Benton telegraph office with Harlan Goss and 2 of his men, and Walt beside her with his rifle, all of them in a loose and improbable formation on the road. And she dictated the wire to Pratt herself, standing at the telegraph counter while the operator looked at the group of them and made the professional decision to ask no questions. Pratt's reply came in 40 minutes. Yes, I received the wire. Assuming you mean business, cooperation will be noted in my submission to the court. Goss read the reply. He folded it and put it in his coat. I need paper, he said to the telegraph operator, who produced it without comment. He sat at the small table in the corner of the telegraph office, and he wrote for 25 minutes. Clara stood near the door with Elsie, and Walt stood near Goss, and the 2 Goss men stood near the horses outside, and nobody spoke, and the only sound in the office was the scratch of Goss's pen and the distant call of a bird somewhere outside, and Elsie's quiet humming to the wooden horse. When he was done, he handed the pages to Clara, and she read them. He had given her Patterson's full name and Denver address. He had given her the names of 2 other investors. He had given her the dates and amounts of the financial arrangements with the railroad and the specific names of the railroad representatives involved. He had given her, in the precise organized hand of a man who'd spent 20 years keeping records of his own operations, the complete architecture of what he'd been building in this territory. It was more than she'd expected. She looked up at him. I've been doing this for 20 years, he said. Patterson has been doing it for 30. He's done this in 4 territories that I know of, different instruments each time. He said it without self-pity and without particular remorse, the tone of a man stating a professional reality. I'm not going to be the only name anyone remembers. Clara looked at what she was holding. Then she looked at Goss. You understand this doesn't settle the claims, she said. The families who lost land, restitution is part of what Pratt is filing for. I understand, he said. Your cooperation is noted, she said. That's all I can offer you. It's enough, he said, and she believed him, because he was a man who understood what enough meant in the specific way that men who do his kind of work understand it, which was that enough was whatever let you walk out of a situation still standing. She walked out of the Benton telegraph office with more paper in her coat than she'd had walking in, and behind her Harlan Goss's horses turned north, and his men rode, and Goss himself, at the last moment, did not look back. Walt was beside her on the step. Did that just happen? He said. Yes, she said. How? She looked at the road north where the dust was settling. She thought about sitting on 2 wooden pallets in Mill Haven, with nothing except her daughter and her refusal to look down. And she thought about the table in Ethan's house where she'd rebuilt the list. And she thought about Ruth Farley's careful years of record-keeping. And she thought about Thomas filing their claim with copies just in case, the quiet thoroughness of a man preparing for a future. I had better documentation than he did, she said. Walt made the sound he made when he'd decided something was finished and didn't need further comment. He went to the horses. She sent 2 wires from the telegraph office. One to Ethan, in Cheyenne, Goss Cooperative, statement obtained, Patterson named, coming south. The other to Ruth Farley, at the Benton station nearest her property. It's moving. Get your neighbors ready. This is going to court. She paid for the wires with the last of the money she'd carried in her boot since Mill Haven. Money she'd been holding back through everything because there had to be something held back. There had to be a bottom to the resource that wasn't zero. Now she spent it on 2 pieces of information traveling at the speed of wire, and it was the best money she'd ever spent. They left for Cheyenne the next morning. The ride south took 2.5 days because she'd been honest with herself about Elsie's pace, and those 2.5 days had a quality unlike any others in the past 3 weeks. Not easy. Nothing had been easy, and she'd stopped expecting it. But different. The urgency had converted into something else, a forward motion that was purposeful rather than desperate, and she could feel the difference in her own body, in the way she sat the saddle and the way she looked at the landscape. Elsie, sensing the change, was in good spirits. She talked to the wooden horse in the serious monologue of a 2-year-old conducting important business, and Walt, riding behind them, listened to this for 2 days with an expression that was doing its best not to be fond and was failing. She talks a lot, he said, on the second afternoon. She has a lot to say, Clara said. Gets that from her mother. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead with the expression of a man who has not said anything and does not intend to. They rode into Cheyenne on a Thursday afternoon in early May, the sky high and clear the way it got in Wyoming when the last of the cold had finally let go. And the town was big enough after weeks of small settlements and open country that Elsie turned her head in every direction at once with wide eyes. Ethan was waiting for them outside Pratt's office. He was standing with his arms crossed and his back against the wall, in the particular way of a man who has been waiting longer than he expected and has made peace with the waiting, and he saw them from half a block away and pushed off the wall and walked toward them. He reached up and took Elsie from Clara's arms before she'd fully stopped her horse, the easy competence of someone who'd done it enough times now to know the weight and the grip. And Elsie went to him without protest and grabbed his coat collar with both hands. "You got my wire," Clara said, dismounting. "I got your wire," he confirmed. He looked at her. He was doing the thing he did when he was assessing something carefully, the thing she'd learned to read as attention rather than distance. "Goss gave you a statement." "Goss gave me Patterson and 2 others and the railroad arrangement," she said. "All of it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "How?" "I gave him the same thing he always gave everyone else," she said. "A clear picture of his situation and a door." Something moved across his face. The door she'd learned to read as the nearest thing he had to open, astonishment. "He just walked out on Patterson," he said. "Patterson would have walked out on him," she said. "He knew that. He's known it for a while." Ethan looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Elsie, who had located the small wooden horse in whatever pocket he'd put it in, and was in the process of extracting it, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved when something had taken him by surprise, and he decided to let himself be taken by it. "Pratt wants to meet with you this afternoon," he said. "He's been waiting." "Then let's not make him wait longer," she said. Pratt turned out to be a tall, angular man of 55 with ink-stained fingers and the slightly disheveled energy of someone who preferred working to most other activities. He greeted Clara with a handshake that was more vigorous than she expected, and then spread her documents across his large desk with the focused appreciation of a man who has been given a meal after a long hunger. I was quiet for a long time, reading. Ethan sat in the corner with Elsie on his knee. Walt stood near the window. Clara sat across from Pratt and let him read. "The Teague account," Pratt said finally, without looking up. "Is it signed and witnessed?" "Signed by Teague, witnessed by 2 parties," Clara said. "The Goss statement." "Signed?" "Signed and dated." Pratt looked up. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has been doing this work for a long time and has arrived at a specific kind of recognition. "Do you know what you've built here?" he said. "A case," Clara said. "The beginning of several cases," he said. "Patterson and the others. This goes federal. The railroad involvement makes it federal." He sat back. "This is going to take time. Months. Possibly a year before full restitution is ordered." "I know," she said. "You'll need to be available. Statements, testimony. The other families will need to be coordinated. Ruth Farley's documentation. She has writers ready," Clara said. "I wired her from Benton. She'll have everything here within a week." Pratt looked at her again with that expression. Then he looked at Ethan. "Where did she come from?" he said. "Ohio originally," Ethan said. "A month ago she was on an auction block in Mill Haven," Walt said, from near the window, with the flat delivery of a man who finds this information clarifying. Pratt absorbed this. He looked back at Clara. "Well," he said, which was not very much but somehow contained quite a lot. "What do I need to sign?" Clara said. She signed what needed signing and answered what needed answering, and when it was done, the afternoon had gone, and the light through Pratt's office window was the same gold sideways light that Wyoming made out of its evenings, and it lay across the desk and across the papers and across the faces of the people in the room and made everything look, for a moment, like something that would last. She walked out of Pratt's office onto the Cheyenne street with Elsie in her arms, and Ethan beside her and Walt behind them, and the evening was cool and smelled like horses and wood smoke, and the particular smell of a town where things happened, and she stood on the step for a moment and breathed. "You need somewhere to sleep," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. "There's a boarding house 2 blocks over. Clean, reasonable. Ruth Farley's riders should be able to find you there." "That works," she said. They walked. Elsie put her head on Clara's shoulder and held the wooden horse and hummed something without a recognizable melody, the internal music of a 2-year-old who had decided the day was over and was beginning the process of ending it. Clara thought about the Whitmore claim. About the 160 acres of Wyoming ground, with Thomas's care built into it, the fence lines he'd set straight, and the cellar he'd dug deep, and the 2 horses that had been fine in their stall while he died in the snow between the house and the barn. She thought about what restitution meant. Not the word, the reality. Whether you could give someone back a piece of ground that carried that much. Whether the ground itself was the thing you were trying to recover, or whether it was something else, something the ground stood in for, something you had to find a different way to reach. She didn't have an answer. She'd learned, in the past weeks, to be more patient with the questions that didn't resolve quickly. Some things took longer to understand than the situation gave you time for, and you had to carry them unresolved until the moment the understanding arrived. Ethan held the door of the boarding house open for her. She went in. Behind her, in the last of the evening light, Cheyenne continued its business, the horses and voices, and the sound of a town doing what towns do, indifferent to the particular weight of what had just been set in motion inside Gideon Pratt's office, indifferent to the woman who had come from an auction block in Mill Haven with nothing except her daughter, and her refusal to look down, and had built, from those materials, something that a federal case could stand on. It didn't know. It wasn't required to. Clara knew. That was sufficient. The boarding house in Cheyenne smelled like lye soap and old timber and someone's boiled supper, and Clara lay awake on the first night listening to Elsie breathe and thinking about everything that still had to happen before any of it was finished. Finished was a long way off. Pratt had said months, possibly a year, and she believed him because she'd learned enough about how legal things moved to understand that the speed of courts was not the speed of human crisis, that the machinery of formal justice ground at its own pace, regardless of how urgent the underlying situation was for the people caught in it. The filing had been submitted. The challenge was on record. Patterson's name was in it, and the railroad representatives, and the full architecture of what Goss had built across 4 years in Wyoming territory. All of that was real and in motion, but 8 families were still displaced. Ruth Farley still had 2 of them living on her property. The Whitmore claim was still in legal limbo, the original filing challenged by a corrupted record that the challenge would eventually overturn, but had not overturned yet. And Clara was lying in a boarding house bed in Cheyenne with 40 cents to her name and a daughter who needed more stability than the past month had provided. And the question of what came next, practically, day by day, was not answered by anything Gideon Pratt had filed. She was not, she noted, afraid. She was tired and she was uncertain, and she had a list of problems that extended past what she could see the end of. But fear was not what she felt. Fear had a different texture from this. Fear was what she'd felt on the auction platform in Mill Haven, what she'd felt when Goss's men took the tin box from her on the road, what she'd felt for the first weeks after Thomas died when survival was not a plan, but a daily question with no guaranteed answer. What she felt now was more like the particular exhaustion of a person who has been running toward something for a long time, and has arrived at it and found that arrival is not the same as rest. She got up before dawn and sat at the small table by the window and made another list. In the morning, Ethan knocked on her door. She opened it, and he was standing in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who has been awake for a while himself and has decided the most useful thing he can do is bring coffee. She took one of the cups and stepped back to let him in, and he came in and sat in the chair she hadn't been sitting in and looked at the list on the table. "You've been up," he said. "Since 4, she said. He looked at the list without picking it up. She'd written it in the compressed telegraphic style she used when she was writing for herself, rather than for anyone else to read. Abbreviated, full of arrows and brackets, the notation of a mind working through a structure. He could probably make out enough of it to understand what she'd been doing. "The practical problems," he said. "Yes," she said, "in order of urgency." "More or less." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside the window, Cheyenne was beginning to stir. The particular sound of a town starting its day, horses and voices, and the clank of something metal somewhere. "The claim will be restored," Ethan said. "Pratt is confident." "In months," she said. "Possibly a year." "Yes." "I can't wait a year in a boarding house," she said. Not complaint, just the plain statement of a logistical reality. "I don't have the money and Elsie needs—" She stopped. She'd been about to say something she'd been circling for days, something she'd been approaching and then pulling back from because it required saying out loud what she wanted, and she'd gotten out of the habit of doing that. Wanting things had been a luxury she couldn't afford for too long, and the habit of not wanting had become its own kind of armor that was hard to take off even when you didn't need it anymore. What does Elsie need? Ethan asked. He asked it simply, without any pressure behind it, the way he asked most things, like the answer mattered and he had the time to hear it. A home, Clara said. A fixed place, something that holds still long enough for her to learn what normal is. She looked at the list. She's 2 years old and she's been in 8 different sleeping places in the past month. She carries that wooden horse everywhere because it's the only thing that hasn't moved. Ethan was quiet. I know the claim will come back, Clara said. I know that. But even when it does, it's Thomas's claim. It's mine by right, and I'll go back to it and rebuild, and that's what I'll do. But right now today, there's a gap between where I am and where that is, and I need to figure out what goes in it. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression she'd been reading for a month now, the one that had been opening incrementally, the door on its hinge that had been moving by degrees towards something she could almost see through it. Stay at the ranch, he said. She looked at him. Not as a favor, he said quickly, and she heard the care in it, the specific care of a man who understood what he was offering and why the terms of it mattered. Not as charity. The ranch needs work I haven't been doing because I've been dealing with this. There's a kitchen garden that's been neglected for 2 years. There are fence lines that need attention. Walt does what he can, but Walt has his own work. He paused. You'd be contributing. It would be a fair arrangement. A working arrangement, Clara said. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the ranch, the small square house and the cottonwoods and the back room where she'd lain awake rebuilding her list, the first place in a month where she'd slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. She thought about Ethan finding the herbs in the tin and asking if she knew what she was doing with them. She thought about him standing in the doorway with the rough wooden horse that he'd carved last winter when he was bored and had given to her daughter without expecting anything from the gesture. Fair arrangement, she said. I'd want that in clear terms. Whatever terms you want, he said. I'll think about what those are, she said. Take your time, he said, which was a thing she'd needed to hear and hadn't known she needed until he said it. Ruth Farley's riders arrived 2 days later with 7 boxes of documentation that Pratt's clerks received with the focused enthusiasm of people who've been waiting for exactly this. Clara spent 3 days in Pratt's office going through the contents with him and 2 of his associates, organizing and indexing and explaining the context of things that needed context. And at the end of the 3rd day, Pratt sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked at her. Patterson's lawyers are going to fight this, he said. I know, she said. They're going to try to discredit Teague. They're going to argue that Goss's statement was coerced. He paused. They're going to look very hard at the circumstances of how all of this was assembled, and they're going to look very hard at you. They can look, she said. You understand what that means, he said. Your history, the auction, and everything that happened in the past month. They'll use it to make you look unreliable. A woman who was auctioned off and used that as the starting point to build a federal land fraud case, Clara said. They're welcome to make that argument. I'm interested to see how a jury receives it. Pratt looked at her. Something in his face that was usually professional and measured shifted into something more direct. So am I, he said. She wired Martin in Denver with an update and a specific request. His formal written account of the letter he'd received, who had signed it, what it said, the date he received it, and the date he'd arrived in Casper. Martin sent it within 48 hours with a covering note that said simply, I should have asked more questions. I'm sorry I didn't. It was not an elegant apology, but it was an honest one, and she wrote back and told him so. The weeks that followed had a quality she hadn't expected. She had anticipated continued urgency, the sustained sprint of the past month, and instead she found something more like the long middle of a difficult thing, the period after the acute crisis, and before the resolution where you have to keep doing the necessary work without the fuel of emergency to run on. It was harder in some ways than the sprint had been. Emergency clarified. Emergency told you exactly what mattered and what didn't, and gave you a reason to keep moving that required no further justification. The long middle asked more of you. It asked you to keep going without the clarity of imminent danger, to sustain attention over time rather than focus in a moment. She went back to the ranch with Elsie while the legal process did what legal processes do, which was move slowly and in ways that were not always visible to the people most affected by them. She negotiated the terms of her arrangement with Ethan on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table, both of them with coffee and Elsie occupied with the wooden horse and a collection of smooth stones she'd found by the creek, And the negotiation was practical and specific and conducted without sentiment because they were both people who understood that clarity and practical arrangements prevented problems that sentiment could not. She would work the kitchen garden and manage the household provisioning and contribute to the fence repair. In return, room and board for herself and Elsie, a small monthly sum, and first access to Ethan's legal contacts in Cheyenne when matters related to the Whitmore claim required them. "And I make my own decisions," she said. "You've been making your own decisions since Millhaven," Ethan said. "That was never in question." "I'm putting it in the terms anyway," she said. "All right," he said. She wrote it down. Both of them signed it. Walt witnessed it from across the room with the expression of a man observing a procedure he finds unnecessary but understands is important to one of the parties. She planted the kitchen garden in late May. The soil was workable, better than she'd expected, and she put in what she knew would grow in Wyoming: root vegetables, beans, squash, and some things she wasn't certain of but wanted to try. Thomas would have known which things were uncertain. Thomas had been a better gardener than she was, more patient with things that needed time. She caught herself talking to him while she worked, not out loud, in the interior way she'd developed since February, the ongoing conversation with the version of him she carried. She told him about the garden and the legal case, and about Ethan Callahan, who had ridden into an auction in Mill Haven and paid for their freedom with no explanation that fully made sense and had not asked for anything in return except the opportunity to offer something else. Thomas, interior, did not have opinions about this. He was good that way. Elsie learned to walk the fence line. This was her independent project, something she'd developed without instruction. Every morning after breakfast, she took her wooden horse and walked the near fence line with the serious concentration of a 2-year-old conducting an inspection, stopping at each post and looking at it for a moment before moving on. Nobody had taught her this. She had invented it. Clara watched it from the kitchen garden with the specific love that comes from watching a child develop their own inner life, their own systems, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a thing that was quieter than happiness, but more durable. Walt watched the fence inspection too, from the barn, with the face of a man who finds it ridiculous and cannot entirely suppress the fact that he finds it charming. "She's going to be a problem," he said to Ethan once, meaning it as a complaint, and Ethan said nothing because they both knew Walt did not mean it as a complaint. June brought the first substantive legal development when Pratt filed the formal motion to restore the corrupted land records. The Patterson Group's lawyers filed their opposition within a week, and the opposition was as aggressive as Pratt had predicted. It attacked Teague's credibility, questioned the chain of custody of the documentation, and included a carefully worded section about the irregular circumstances by which the evidence had been assembled, which was the euphemistic version of what Pratt had warned her about. Pratt sent her a copy of the opposition with a letter that said, among other things, "They're fighting hard because Patterson knows what this costs him if it goes through. That's useful information. Men only fight this hard for things they're genuinely afraid of losing." She read the opposition twice, sitting at Ethan's kitchen table in the evening. Then she set it down and went to the window and stood there for a while looking at the cottonwoods along the creek, which had filled out in the weeks since she'd arrived, full summer green now, the kind of green that felt like abundance. Ethan came in from outside and saw her standing there. "Pratt's letter?" he said. "The opposition," she said. He came to stand beside her. Not close, just near. The specific nearness of someone who has decided the most they can offer right now is presence and has offered it. "How bad?" he said. "About what he expected," she said. "They're going to make noise about Teague, about how I got his statement." She paused. "About me." "You've handled Goss and Patterson in a federal legal case from a standing start in a month," Ethan said. "You can handle lawyers making noise." "I know," she said. "Do you?" he said, not challenging, just asking. She looked at the cottonwoods. "I know it strategically," she said. "What I know strategically and what I feel when I'm standing at this window at 8 in the evening are sometimes different things." He was quiet for a moment. "That seems honest," he said. "I've been trying to be honest," she said. "I spent a lot of the past 2 months being strategic, and I'm not sure I always knew the difference." He looked at her sideways. "You knew the difference," he said. "You were strategic about facts, about information and timing, and who to approach and how. You weren't strategic about what mattered." She thought about that. She thought about standing in the hotel room doorway in Casper looking at Martin's face. She thought about sitting with Teague in the boarding house on the second floor. She thought about the way she'd told Goss she wasn't going to fight him, that the documents were already in Cheyenne, that the door she was offering him was the most honest assessment of his situation she could give. No, she said, I wasn't strategic about what mattered. They stood there for a while with the evening and the cottonwoods. I want to tell you something, Ethan said. He said it with the particular care of someone who has been holding a thing and has decided it's time to put it down in the open where it can be looked at. When I rode into Millhaven that day, I'd been not well. That's not the right word. He stopped, tried again. I'd been spending too much time on this land alone. After I left the cavalry, after the things that had happened, I'd been disappearing into the work, which is something I know how to do, and it was fine, it was functional, but he paused. I rode into Millhaven and I saw you on that platform, and I thought, he stopped again, and she waited, because she'd learned his pauses were not empty. They were him finding the right thing rather than the nearest thing. I thought, that woman is not going to let this beat her, and I couldn't tell you why I thought it. I just saw it, and I realized I hadn't seen that quality in anything for a long time, including myself. Clara looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the cottonwoods. You bought us because you needed reminding, she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Maybe, he said. That sounds less good than the version I told you. Some things are worth more than gold, she said, and she heard the echo of it, his own words from the auction platform. I believed it when I said it, he said. I know, she said. That's why I got off the platform. He looked at her then. The door that had been moving on its hinge for the past month was open, and she could see what was on the other side of it clearly now, and she thought it was probably the same thing she'd been carrying on her side of the door without fully naming it. Not the sweeping, unearned feeling of a story. Something more specific and more earned. The feeling of two people who'd seen each other clearly in difficult conditions and found that what they saw was something they could work with, something they wanted to work with. I'm not in a position to make promises, she said. Not yet. The claim isn't settled, and I don't know exactly what I'll be or where I'll be when it is. I'm not asking for promises, he said. She stopped. I'm making sure you know I'm not in a position to be grateful in a way that commits me to things. I've been dependent on you, and it can make a person feel things they'd feel differently if they were on more equal ground. I know, he said. Do you? I've been thinking about it since Millhaven, he said. The difference between someone who needs what you have and someone who wants you specifically. I know the difference. He looked at her steadily. I can wait until the ground is more equal. It might take a year, she said. I've been on this land alone for 6 years, he said. A year is not a difficult proposition. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. They went back to the practical things, which was the right thing to do, and the evening resolved into the ordinary rhythms of the ranch. And Clara thought as she went to sleep that night that she'd been right. The feeling was more specific and more earned than a story, and the fact that it required patience was not a flaw in it but a feature. Some things only meant what they meant because they'd taken the time they'd taken to get there. The federal investigation into Elias Patterson opened in August. Pratt had been right about what the Patterson name meant in the wider context. It opened not just the Wyoming land fraud, but threads that connected to 2 other territories and a pattern of railroad-adjacent acquisition schemes that had been running for 15 years. The federal investigators who arrived in Cheyenne in August were not small territory men. They were the kind of investigators who arrived with authority and resources and the specific institutional patience of people who intended to take the whole thing apart. Clara gave her formal statement over 2 days in a federal office building in Cheyenne. Ethan came with her, not to intervene, not to advise, just present, the way he'd been present at the window that evening, the specific quality of someone who understands that some things you have to do alone, and what they can offer is being there on the perimeter of it. She told the investigators everything in the precise chronological order she'd been organizing it in her head since March. The claim, the riders, the road, the tin box, Millhaven, the auction, the journey to the ranch, the plan, Casper, Martin, and the hotel room, Teague, Goss's statement, Pratt. She told it without drama, without the heightened language of someone performing their own story, just the sequence of events, and the decisions she'd made and the reasons she'd made them. She was there for 6 hours on the first day and 4 hours on the second, and by the end of it, the lead investigator, a precise woman named Hartley, who had the air of someone who'd heard many testimonies and could distinguish between people reporting facts and people constructing narratives, looked at Clara across the table and said, "You kept good records." "My husband taught me," Clara said. Hartley nodded. "The documentation you assembled is among the clearest I've seen in a land fraud case of this scope," she said. "Whoever trained you to keep paper was right." Thomas, Clara thought, would have found that deeply satisfying. She allowed herself to think it and then let it go, and thanked Investigator Hartley and went to find Ethan in the hallway outside. He looked at her face when she came out. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. "How was it?" "Long," she said, "and useful." She straightened her jacket. "They're going to get Patterson." "You're sure?" "Hartley is sure," she said. "And she doesn't seem like a woman who's sure about things she isn't sure about." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You know who else that describes," he said. "I'm not going to answer that," she said, but something moved in her face that she didn't try to stop. They rode back to the ranch in the September evening. Elsie had been with Walt, which was an arrangement that had evolved over the summer without being formally decided. Walt had opinions about the arrangement, but his opinions had been overruled by the fact of Elsie herself, who had decided, with the sovereign certainty of a 2-year-old, that Walt was her particular person at the ranch. And Walt had discovered that it was very difficult to maintain preemptive irritation toward a small child who conducted fence inspections and had views about the placement of stones. When they got back, Elsie was asleep in the barn in a pile of hay with the wooden horse in her fist, and Walt's coat spread over her, and Walt was sitting outside the barn on an upturned crate reading by the last of the light, and he looked up at them when they rode in and said, "How'd it go?" "Well," Ethan said. "Federal?" Walt said. "Federal," Clara confirmed. Walt nodded. He looked back at his book. "Wake me when it's actually over," he said, which was Walt, for I'm glad. The autumn was the most ordinary period Clara had experienced since the winter before Thomas died, which meant it was extraordinary in its own quiet way, the extraordinariness of stable ground. She worked the ranch and tended the garden through the last of the harvest, and began putting up stores for winter with the particular satisfaction of someone who knew what winter looked like when you went into it unprepared. Ethan worked beside her when the work overlapped, and they had the kind of conversations that develop between people who are in proximity over time. Not the intense, focused exchanges of crisis, but the accumulative, rambling kind, conversations about small things that were really about larger things in the way that most genuine conversation is. She told him about Ohio and her father's printing office. He told her about 10 years in the cavalry and what the land looked like from a horse across a distance and why he'd come to Wyoming specifically and not somewhere else. She told him about Thomas, not the grief of it, which she kept in its own place, but the person, the specifics, the way Thomas had been in the world, because she'd found that keeping Thomas only in grief was a kind of diminishment of him, and she didn't want to do that. Ethan listened the way he listened to most things, with his full attention and without making it about himself. "He sounds like someone worth the missing," Ethan said once. "He was," she said. "He is." "Both at once," he said. "Both at once," she agreed. "That's exactly what it is." The formal ruling on the land records came in November. Pratt sent a rider with the news before the official document arrived, because he understood that the official document moved at official speed, and the people it concerned deserved to know before that. The rider arrived on a Tuesday morning when Clara was in the garden, pulling the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze, and she read Pratt's letter standing in the dirt with mud on her hands and the November sky overhead. The ruling restored the original filings for all 8 affected claims. Teague's alterations were formally voided. The county record would be corrected within 30 days. Restitution proceedings for the displaced families would open in January with an expected timeline of resolution within 6 months. The Whitmore claim was hers. She stood in the mud for a while and didn't do anything in particular. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to feel. Relief, maybe. The sharp, specific relief of a long-held tension releasing. But what she felt was something quieter than that. Something more like the feeling at the end of a very long conversation, when you've said everything that needed saying and the other person has heard it, and the silence after is not absence but completion. She folded Pratt's letter and went to find Ethan. He was in the barn with a fence post and Walt, doing the fall maintenance they'd been putting off because there were always more urgent things. She came in and held out the letter without saying anything. He took it and read it, and his face moved through several things, and then settled into the particular stillness that, on him, was not absence of emotion, but its depth. January for restitution proceedings, he said. 6 months estimated after that, she said. He looked at her. So by next summer you'll have your claim and whatever comes out of the restitution. Yes. Walt had taken the letter from Ethan and was reading it with the expression of a man who expected good news and finds it only partially satisfying because now he has nothing to be preemptively irritated about. He handed it back to Clara. The other families, he said. They'll get theirs too, Clara said. Ruth Farley's 2 families first. They've been on her land since spring. Walt nodded. He picked up the fence post. Good, he said, which on Walt was a considerable statement. The news moved through the valley faster than Clara expected. Ruth Farley rode over herself the following morning, which was not something she did casually given the distance, and arrived with the particular energy of a woman who has been holding something compressed for a long time and has just been told she can let it go. She stood in Clara's kitchen and looked at the letter herself and read it the same way Clara had read it, standing with the weight of it, and then looked up. We owe you, she said. Not effusively, just directly, the way Ruth did most things. You kept records for 2 years on my behalf before you knew me, Clara said. We're even. We're not even, Ruth said, but I'll accept it. She stayed for lunch, which turned into 3 hours of conversation about what the valley was going to look like when the 8 families were back on their land and the railroad situation was resolved, and the weight of Goss's systematic clearing had been lifted. Ruth had opinions about this. Detailed, thought-out, specific opinions about community organization and shared resources and how the valley could function differently if the people in it made different arrangements than the isolated self-sufficiency that had made them individually vulnerable. Clara listened and offered her own thoughts, and found that her own thoughts had developed, over the past months, into something more organized than she'd realized. You should come to the January proceedings, Clara told Ruth. All of your families should be there. I'll make sure of it, Ruth said. Will you speak? Pratt wants me to, Clara said. I've been thinking about what to say. I imagine what you'll say will be sufficient, Ruth said, which from Ruth Farley was the equivalent of considerable praise, and Clara accepted it in the spirit it was given. December came with a cold that was familiar and no longer threatening, the cold of a winter she was prepared for, and the ranch felt different in winter preparation than it had felt in the frantic weeks of spring. She put up stores and winterized the garden and watched Elsie navigate her first Wyoming winter with the fascinated attention of a child discovering snow for the first time as something to be engaged with rather than endured. Elsie discovered snow. This was not a small event. Elsie had opinions about snow. She believed snow was for walking in and sitting in and picking up and attempting to eat. And she communicated these opinions with the full force of a personality that had, over the months at the ranch, become considerably more itself. She talked now in full sentences that were not always entirely comprehensible but were clearly fully considered, and she had preferences and objections and the particular stubborn streak that Clara recognized from her own reflection and from the memory of Thomas digging a cellar by himself because someone had told him the soil was too rocky. She watched her daughter in the snow one December morning from the window of the main house and felt something she'd been feeling more frequently, a feeling that was not dramatic and not simple and that she didn't have a single word for. The feeling of being in a place that had become, by accumulation of days, hers. Not just hers to use. Hers in the way that mattered, the way that meant she recognized it from the inside, the way the morning light came through the east window, and the particular sound the wind made in the cottonwoods, and the creak of the third board from the left in the front door that she'd told Ethan about 3 times, and he hadn't fixed because he'd learned to step over it and had forgotten it was a problem. She turned from the window and started breakfast, and Ethan came in from outside with firewood and said good morning, and she said good morning, and that was the whole of it, and the whole of it was sufficient, which was not a small thing. The January proceedings in Cheyenne were formal and long and covered in procedural language that obscured the human content of what was being decided, the way legal proceedings often did. Clara sat through 2 days of it with Pratt at her elbow, translating the procedural language into meaning, and gave her testimony on the second afternoon. She had thought about what to say, as she'd told Ruth she was thinking about it, and she'd decided, against Pratt's gentle suggestion that she keep it focused on the specific facts of her case, to say something about what she'd observed in the valley, about the 8 families and what the systematic dispossession had cost them, about what documentation had made possible and what the absence of legal protection had cost people who couldn't afford lawyers and didn't know how to fight systems designed to be confusing. She said it plainly and without drama, and in the precise chronological order she'd been trained by habit to use. And she said it looking at the panel of 3 judges who were deciding the restitution question, not performing it for them, but genuinely addressing them, genuinely trying to make them understand something beyond the legal record. She talked for 40 minutes. When she was done, the room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something has been said that has settled into the air rather than bouncing off it. One of the judges, an older man with a measured face and the look of someone who'd heard many testimonies over many years, looked at her for a moment and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, you assembled the evidence for this case while simultaneously managing a young child and a personal crisis of considerable magnitude. How do you account for that?" Clara thought about it. She thought about what she actually believed, which was the only thing worth saying in a setting like this. "I had something to prove," she said. "Not to anyone in this room. To the version of myself that was standing on an auction block in Millhaven in April, being told she wasn't worth the price of a coin." She paused. "When someone tells you that you have no value, you have 2 options. You can believe them, or you can build the evidence against it." She held his gaze. "I built the evidence." The restitution ruling came in March. All 8 families received formal restoration of their claims and financial restitution for the period of dispossession. The amounts were not lavish. No ruling in a federal court was ever going to fully compensate a family for what they'd lost in the months they'd spent displaced. And Clara knew this and had known it, and had not let the gap between full justice and available justice stop her from pursuing what was available. Patterson received the heaviest legal penalties, as Goss had anticipated. Goss himself, for his cooperation, received a significantly reduced outcome that he accepted without public comment. Teague lost his position in the county filing office and was barred from public service positions in the territory, which was, of Clara's considered opinion, appropriate to what he'd done, the fitting loss of the tool he'd used. The railroad's arrangement with the investment group was voided. The railroad itself was investigated separately, and while the resolution of that was longer and slower and less complete than the land fraud case, it happened, and the fact of it happening mattered in ways that would extend beyond the specific valley in Wyoming where 8 families had lost their homes. Clara rode back to the ranch from Cheyenne in the March thaw, when the snow was softening and the land was beginning to do what land does when winter releases it, the small visible evidence of return that she had learned in Ohio to read as promise. She had her claim. She had restitution, not a large amount but real. She had, for the first time since February of the previous year, the material foundation to make choices rather than to survive them. The question of the Whitmore claim, whether to go back to it, what to do with it, what it meant to her now, was one she'd been carrying alongside everything else for months, and she'd been honest with herself that the carrying of it was complicated. The land was hers. It had been Thomas's and hers together, and now it was hers. She could rebuild on it. 160 acres of Wyoming ground that she and Thomas had chosen together and filed papers on together and planned a future on together. She sat with this for a while on the road back to the ranch, just herself and the horse and the March thaw and the question. What she found, sitting with it, was that the land itself was neutral. The land didn't carry the weight she'd been putting on it. The land was just land, good ground, workable, worth something, the thing she'd fought for. But the life she'd been building for the past year was not on the Whitmore claim. It was on Ethan's ranch, in the kitchen garden, and the fence line in the back room, and the morning light through the east window. It was in Ruth Farley riding over and the 3 hours of conversation about what the valley could become. It was in Walt stepping over the third board from the left and pretending the fence inspection was beneath his dignity. It was in Elsie learning to walk that fence line with a wooden horse in her fist. She knew what she wanted. She'd been knowing it for several months and had been not quite saying it because the ground hadn't been equal, and she'd meant what she'd said about the ground needing to be equal. The ground was equal now. She arrived at the ranch in late afternoon, and Ethan came out of the barn when he heard the horse and looked at her face while she dismounted and said, "The ruling came through." "Yes," she said. "The claim is fully yours." "Yes," she said. He waited. "I want to talk about the Whitmore claim," she said. "All right," he said. They went inside and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd signed the working arrangement 9 months ago, and where she'd read Pratt's letter, and where she'd made so many lists that the wood had learned the particular weight of her elbows. Walt was not in the house, which might have been coincidence or might not have been. I want to lease the Whitmore claim, she said, to one of the families from Ruth Farley's property who needs land, long-term lease, fair terms, with the option to purchase after 5 years if they want it. Ethan listened. I want to stay here, she said. Not as a working arrangement, not as... She stopped, organized it. I want to stay here because this is where I want to be. And I want to know if that's something you want too. On equal ground. With both of us knowing what we're choosing and why. She held his gaze the way she'd held every gaze that had mattered in the past year. Directly, without flinching, giving it the full weight of what she was doing. He was quiet for a moment. Not performing the consideration, actually having it. Yes, he said. One word. But it was the kind of yes that contained its full history, everything that had built it, Millhaven and the road and the ranch and 9 months of daily accumulation, the lists on the table and the coffee at 4 in the morning and the evening at the window with the cottonwoods and 100 small ordinary moments that had done the work that dramatic moments could only begin. Then that's decided, she said. That's decided, he agreed. She looked at the table for a moment. She thought about a woman on an auction platform who had nothing left and didn't look down. She thought about what that woman would have understood about where she was going to end up, and she thought the honest answer was nothing. That woman could not have seen this from where she was standing, could not have planned for it or imagined it with any accuracy. All she'd been doing was refusing to let go, and sometimes that was enough. Not always. She knew it wasn't always enough. She'd seen too many people who'd refused to let go and been let go of anyway, by weather or sickness, or the specific cruelty of systems designed to grind particular people down. She hadn't earned this by virtue of her refusal alone. She'd had Walt and Ruth Farley and Martin's copies and Thomas's habit of making sure, and Ethan at the exact right moment on the exact right road. She'd had luck alongside the work, and she was old enough and honest enough to know the difference and to hold both without making either one into a story about herself. What she believed, and she'd been building toward this belief for a year, the way you build toward anything solid, brick by brick in the available light, was that the most important choice any person got was the choice about what to do with what they were given. You didn't choose the winter. You didn't choose the men who came to the door with their polite voices and their legal maneuvers. You didn't choose the auction block. But you chose, every single day, whether the thing that had happened to you was the last word on what you were worth. She had chosen, standing on 2 wooden pallets in Millhaven, not to let it be. And she kept choosing it day by day, the way real things are built, not in a single moment of courage, but in the accumulated refusal to stop, which is less dramatic and more reliable, and the only kind of building that actually holds. That spring, Ruth Farley organized a valley gathering for the families who'd had their claims restored, the first time all of them had been in the same place since before Goss's men had started moving through the territory. It was held at the largest property in the valley, and people came from 8 different homesteads and brought food and children and the specific energy of people who have been through something hard together and have arrived on the other side of it and find themselves surprised to be there. Clara went with Ethan and Elsie and Walt, who came under protest and was visibly glad he'd come within 20 minutes of arriving. She stood in the afternoon and watched the valley full of people and thought about what it had looked like a year ago. The same ground, the same sky, but emptier in a way that was not about the number of people, but about what was possible, what you could imagine for it. The imagination of a place was a real thing, she'd decided, as real as the soil or the fence lines or the recorded filings in the county office. You could damage it, you could restore it, and the restoring of it was the kind of work that didn't look like much from the outside, but was everything from the inside. Elsie ran across the gathering in the direction of 2 other children she'd identified as interesting, the wooden horse still in her fist, her small legs covering ground with the absolute conviction of someone who knows exactly where they're going, and Clara watched her and felt the familiar thing. The thing she couldn't say in a single word, that was bigger than happiness and quieter than joy, and had roots that went down into the hard months, and came up as this. Ethan came to stand beside her. She dropped the horse, he said. Clara looked. Elsie had dropped the wooden horse in her sprint across the field, and hadn't noticed, was already at the other children with her arms going in every direction in the language of 2-year-olds conducting urgent social business. The wooden horse lay in the grass. Clara looked at it for a moment. She thought about the night in the doorway when Ethan had offered it with no expectation, the rough small thing carved in a long winter. She thought about how Elsie had carried it through every sleeping place and every road and every crisis of the past year, clutching it in crisis and in calm. the anchor of a child who needed something to hold. And now she'd put it down, not lost it. Just put it down because she'd found something more immediately interesting, because the world was full of interesting things, and she was 2 years old and her hands were needed for other purposes. That was how it worked. That was exactly how it worked. You held on to the thing you needed until you didn't need it in the same way anymore, and then you put it down, not because it stopped mattering, but because your hands were needed for what came next. Ethan walked out into the field and picked up the wooden horse and held it in his palm for a moment. He looked at it the way he looked at most things, steadily, without hurry, giving it its due. Then he looked up at Clara. She crossed the field to him. He held out the wooden horse. She took it. "You can give it back to her later," he said. "I know," she said. She held it in her hand, the small, rough weight of it, the horse that had gotten them from there to here in Elsie's fist through the whole long distance of it. It wasn't magic. It was a piece of wood that a man had carved in a lonely winter because he had to do something with his hands. But it had been the right thing at the right moment, and those two things together, right thing, right moment, were as close to what mattered as she'd ever been able to get. She put the wooden horse in her coat pocket. Around her the valley gathered and talked, and children ran, and the afternoon light did what Wyoming afternoon light did, going long and golden across everything, making the ordinary world look like it was trying to tell you something. She let it.